Well, good afternoon if you're on the East Coast, and good morning if you're way out west. My name is Aaron Lacey, and you are listening to the Head Committee Negotiated Rulemaking Accountability Debrief, which is part of the Thompson Coburn Higher Education webinar series. Thompson Coburn, if you don't know us, is a law firm. We have, I think it says 450. It's closer to 500 now, attorneys nationwide and offices around the country in major markets. And we have a higher education practice, which means we have a group of lawyers who spend all or most of their time serving institutions of higher education. My name is Aaron Lacey. I'm a co-chair and partner in the higher education practice. And my particular area of expertise, among other things, is federal policy, particularly around the federal financial aid programs and at the level of the U.S. Department of Education. Here is some housekeeping we can go ahead and get done while folks are still joining. First of all, there is a Q&A widget on your screen. If you have questions during the presentation, please feel free to go ahead and type those in. And at the end, we will start going through those and see how many we can get answered. There's a resource widget. I really want to call your attention to that. In addition to having the slides to the presentation, there's a PDF there or access to a PDF. And that has live links in it. And there's a lot of links to a lot of underlying resources for this presentation. So please be sure to check that out. We also have links to a couple of other documents, I think. One is a very important spreadsheet from the U.S. Department of Education I will be talking about later. And also the almost final draft regulatory text. I actually got an email about an hour ago with the final draft regulatory text. The difference between what we have and the final is very, very de minimis. But nonetheless, the final is now out there, and I suspect will be posted to the department's website very shortly. So be sure to check out the resource widget. The help widget, if you've got technical issues, there's a lot of good advice there. There's a post-webinar survey. I'm always extremely grateful. We are always grateful to folks if they'll take time to fill that out, because it really helps us make sure that every presentation is better than the one before. And lastly, if you are a lawyer and you are tuning in for continuing legal education credit, I'm going to read off my screen to my left here. Today's presentation is CLE accredited in California, Illinois, and Texas for 2 hours of general credit, in Missouri for 2.4 hours of general credit, and in New York for 2 hours of professional practice credit for experienced and transitional attorneys. Throughout the program, there will be some secret words. We'll stop and announce those secret words, and just make sure if you're an attorney looking for CLE credit that you click the button so we know that you are here. We give CLE credit based on your time and attendance. All right, let's keep moving. Just a couple other items I wanted to highlight for you, particularly if you're watching this after the fact on YouTube. First of all, laws and policies are updated regularly. And so we just encourage folks, if you're watching this, weeks or months after this presentation was first made available, things may have changed. In fact, in this case, we very much expect a proposed rule and then ultimately a final rule. There are live hyperlinks, as I mentioned previously, throughout these slides, and you can click on those and they will take you to important information. Just want to make sure to highlight that. And then finally, this webinar, a lot of other materials that we make available, future presentations, our very popular litigation summary covering higher education litigation issues and tracking important cases, all is available at our Regucation website, which is where we house all our free legal resources. And you can get there either by clicking on that link or by scanning that QR code. Here's today's syllabus. I got a lot I'm going to try to cover for you. I'm going to talk about the head committee, negotiables and non-negotiables in the context of the negotiations. And then we're going to get into the draft proposal. We're going to talk about projected impact, reporting requirements, disclosure and distribution requirements, an overview of the earnings premium test, median annual earnings, the earnings threshold, the consequence of failure, and GE program certifications. Is this an ambitious agenda, Aaron, you ask? Yes, it is, but I think this is an important topic. You may have noted we expanded this session today. It was originally scheduled for 90 minutes, and we pushed it out, I think it was 90 minutes to 2 hours because we wanted to have the time to really get through everything. I will also pledge to folks now, I don't want to bury the lead. I'll mention it on a slide in a second, but the committee did reach consensus, which means that a proposed rule is forthcoming, and it's going to look a lot like, very similar to the draft text that was voted on by the committee. So what that means is everything I'm telling you today, we expect the proposed rule to very closely resemble what we're talking about. But that being said, when the proposed rule comes out, we will go through it, and I will do another webinar going through probably in even more detail all the elements, and then maybe making recommendations for potential comment during the public comment period. All right, so let's start with the conversation around the head committee. If you tuned into our debriefing from week one, you'll recognize a couple of three of these slides, but hang in there. First of all, if this is really important, all the materials that have been disseminated for the negotiated rulemaking this entire year, going all the way back to public student loan forgiveness, public service loan forgiveness, and then also the RISE committee, all of that is on this website, the 2025-26 negotiated rulemaking website, as well as all the materials relating to the head committee. So you can click on that link and find all of that there. This was the head committee's composition. So you had a pretty even representation. If you're not familiar with neg reg, the way it works is the department wants particular constituencies represented at the table, and they try to have a balance of constituencies. So the Navy represents folks who are representing students and former students. The green represents folks who were representing institutions. You had a number of state agencies that were represented and accrediting agencies as well. And then you had someone representing employers and their view, and taxpayers and their interest. And some of this was designed really with the workforce Pell discussions from week one, in particular, like you look at state workforce agencies, which were very important in those conversations. And some of it was designed more towards accountability. One committee talking about both of these topics. So they were trying to cover all their bases. The names of primary and alternate negotiators, if you don't know who they are, if you wanted to reach out to them for some reason, are all on the department's website. I was the primary negotiator representing private nonprofit institutions at the table, and my alternate was Joanne Roche from Liberty University, who did a wonderful job, and my sincere thanks to Joanne for being such a great teammate. Ahead issues that were on the table during the first week of negotiations, we were talking primarily around workforce Pell and other Pell issues. And during this most recent week, we were talking about the integration of the existing financial value transparency and gainful employment rule and the new do no harm accountability framework in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. So this past week was all about accountability and trying to integrate those frameworks in a way that makes sense. So there we go. Those are the 2 weeks that we met and the topics that I just articulated that were discussed during each week. Ahead protocols. So when committees meet, there are protocols, and each administration from one administration to the next can change that up a little bit. A negotiated rulemaking committee reaches consensus when all negotiators agree to the draft regulatory text that has been proposed. The department's approach, historically, most of the time, and this administration's approach, is they want consensus on all of the issues that are being discussed. But this administration has done things a little bit differently, at least with regard to our committee. Even though we were one rulemaking committee, week one, we negotiated all the Pell issues. And at the end of the week, we voted for consensus on all those issues as a package. And that was really viewed as totally separate from our most recent week, where we talked about the accountability issues and we voted on the consensus. We voted for consensus on the accountability issues at the end of that week. So even though we were one committee, the department sort of treated it like we were almost like two separate rulemakings, each a week long. The idea is if consensus is reached, the department is bound when it issues its proposed rule to use the draft regulatory text that reached consensus. If you do not reach consensus, the department is free to do whatever it wants to do. This is a critical point because it plays into the dynamics and negotiations during the week, right? I mean, one thing negotiators have to be thoughtful about is I have a few things that I like. I may have a few things I don't like. At the end of the week, do I want to vote for consensus and lock in the department to the things that I like, and can I tolerate the things I don't like in this rule that's in front of me? Or do I want to roll the dice, not vote for consensus, and do I have confidence that the department left to its own devices will come up with something that is still favorable? So you're always having to think about that as you go through the week. And the department, of course, is well aware of this dynamic as well and uses it to its own advantage when it is negotiating the changes that it wants to make or to reject. The department in this case, again, stipulated that the head committee would vote for consensus at the end of each week. And that is a little bit different. They also agreed that if we got to consensus at the end of week one, what happened in week two over accountability wouldn't change the week one result and vice versa. On Friday of the first week of negotiations, the head committee reached consensus on the issues relating to Pell Grants, right? And this is noteworthy because the RISE committee also reached consensus. So this was two consensus outings in a row. By the way, the draft language from the week one consensus that relates to Pell Grants is available on the neg reg site. You can also click that link. Definitely don't want to. Oh, by the way, if you want to know more about week one, if you missed our first debrief, we did a pretty in-depth review of the workforce Pell and Pell discussions that occurred during week one. Week two, the week that just completed, we once again reached consensus as a committee. Gainful employment / accountability has been negotiated. I think this was the fifth time, and it's the first time it's ever reached consensus, which is significant for a lot of reasons. Among them, we know now then what the department is going to use as the basis for its proposed rule. So you can look at this draft regulatory text and start planning with a fairly high level of confidence. That being said, please keep in mind that after the department issues its proposed rule, there's a public comment period, and then the department is permitted to make changes to the final rule based on the feedback it gets during public comment. So what you can do right now is start thinking sort of broadly about what this rule is probably going to look like and how it may impact your institution, but you can also start today largely preparing public comments based on the draft regulatory text, because the proposed rule is going to look like that draft regulatory text. You may not want to completely carry out, action items until you see the final rule, although I think that's a decision each institution is going to have to make based on the type of programming you offer and the level of risk that this rule poses to you. I just want to say a note of thanks to everyone on the head committee and to the department, to a person, and I cannot be any more sincere and genuine in this comment. Everyone on that committee had a high level of experience and expertise and professionalism. People really did show up to try to listen and negotiate. We certainly did not all agree. We were not all happy with the text at the end of the day. That's probably why it represented a reasonable compromise, is because nobody got everything they wanted. But the individuals participating in this process certainly were doing so in good faith and just brought a great deal of, again, expertise and experience to the table. That's not so much backpatting for myself. I really mean for the other folks and the department as well. The department brought just an incredible amount of data to the table in connection with this rulemaking, and also got everything to us 6-7 days in advance. So that was deeply appreciated. A real shout out to Dave Musser, who was the non-federal negotiator leading things for the department, and to the facilitators who sat in and facilitated. They did a wonderful job as well. I mean, we actually took a picture together, which is somewhat unusual for a neg-reg group. So it sort of speaks to the level of cooperation and good faith sort of professionalism and effort that was at the table. So thank you to everyone who was part of that. We speculate, thinking in terms of next steps, that the department is probably going to release 2 different proposed rule-making packages, one around the workforce Pell issues and one around accountability, notwithstanding the fact that they were, in a technical sense, all part of a single rulemaking. There's nothing that requires a department to issue a single big package covering both topics. It seems to make a lot more sense that they would do so separately. We think the department's looking to get these out in the spring. I mean, that's consistent with statements that have been made publicly. They are moving very quickly. They also have suggested, that we're going to see more rulemakings. So I would expect these proposed rules for both, if the department can pull it off, for both Pell and for accountability to hit sometime in the spring. Please be on the lookout, because as you will probably get 30 to 60 days for public comment. These are very important issues, not to diminish workforce Pell at all, but I'll just say particularly accountability in my world. So please look for those. Start working on your public comments now, and not to upsell, but this is what we do for a living. If you are interested in assistance in preparing comments or understanding this rule for the basis of your own comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. It's important to raise concerns. Just some advice for those who are thinking about starting the public comment purpose. Don't just raise concerns, but also express support, right? I think our tendency is to tell the department the things about the rule we don't like, but it's equally important to express to the department support for the things that you do like as you're preparing your proposed rule. Please be aware of the elements of the regulation that simply restate statute. Aaron, why are you bringing that up? A considerable and meaningful component of this regulatory accountability framework is in the statutory framework, the do no harm statutory framework. In other words, there are the tests that are being applied to graduate level degree programs and undergraduate level degree programs are in statute, not regulation. So you can comment to the department that you do not like those tests, and you take a lot of issues with the idea of applying an earnings premium to certain types of programs. It doesn't measure value. It doesn't measure lifetime financial value or value to society. And look, those things are all true. And if you feel compelled to file those comments, no issue at all. but just understand that the department can't change statute. So to the extent that there are things that you are asking the department not to do or to change, if they are in the statute, you are probably not going to see movement. And I just say when you're preparing public comments, then it's worth knowing where are the things that the department can potentially change and what are the things that they cannot change. And I highlight this particularly in this instance and around accountability because, again, I mentioned this is the 5th time accountability has been negotiated. It's the first time in the 15 years through all these neg regs that we've had a statute that actually said this is how we want the department to do certain things. So this would be the first time that you would have that statutory language to be thoughtful about. Finally, I just want to reiterate the department has to issue a proposed rule that it sticks close to the draft regulatory text that I'm going to talk about today, but they have flexibility to change the final rule based on public comment. So your public comments are not useless or without, that they do serve an important purpose. And I would really encourage folks, if you see things, particularly in the regulatory parts that aren't baked into the statute, that you think aren't going to work or don't make sense, or if you're in one of the industries that is disproportionately, or I say programs that is disproportionately impacted by this rule, you want to be thoughtful about all of that. So to help you with that distinction, let me talk about the things that were sort of negotiables and non-negotiables at the table, and this can also inform your approach to public comments. First of all, just as a starting point, because if you don't know this, you may struggle to really have meaning in a lot of the rest of this presentation. Let's talk about what constitutes a gainful employment program. That is still a concept. It is in the law. And this comes out of statute. Since 1965, the Higher Education Act has said certain types of eligible programs have to, quote, prepare students for gainful employment in a recognized occupation. So if your program qualifies as an eligible Title IV program, in one of those buckets that includes this language, it's a gainful employment program. That would include, for public and private nonprofit institutions, any non-degree program. So your non-degree certificates, it could be a graduate certificate, it could be an undergraduate certificate, a post-baccalaureate certificate. If it's not a degree and it's Title IV eligible, it's a gainful employment program, right? Your degree programs, if you are a public or private nonprofit, are not gainful employment programs. Those are non-GE programs. For proprietary institutions, everything's a gainful employment program. It's just that simple, right? So as I talk about GE and non-GE programs and how things apply differently, please keep in mind a gainful employment program, if you're a private nonprofit or a public institution, is your non-degree programming. Your degree programming is non-GE programs. And for proprietary institutions, as they well know, most of them, everything's a gainful employment program. Okay, so GE program versus non-GE program. This also gives you a sense of the buckets, right? And this is just another way of thinking about this briefly. So all the things you see right there, and this is really for private, nonprofit, and public institutions. Again, everything's a GE program if you're a proprietary school. But for the rest of you guys in traditional higher ed, the stuff in orange, those are your non-GE programs, and the stuff in black, those are your gainful employment programs. Just another way of thinking about it. Okay. Now let's talk a little bit about the existing financial value transparency and gainful employment framework. I'm just going to give a really brief overview of it, but this is the regulation that's on the books right now. So disclosure and reporting requirements, most of you are familiar with those because you were working through them over the last year. Program information website. It's that existing regulation, the financial value transparency and G rule, that creates that whole new program information website where the department's supposed to be publishing all of these different data points and the results of the metrics. There are 2 accountability tests in the existing financial value transparency and gainful employment rule. You've got the DE rates, that's the debt to earnings rates test, and then you've got the earnings premium test. So you've got 2 accountability tests in the regulation. And finally, there are sanctions for gainful employment programs in the regulation. This is really important. Under the regulation, non-GE programs are not subject to the potential loss of Title IV. Under the regulation, GE programs can lose all Title IV, which includes loans and Pell Grant eligibility. So this is all negotiable because this is in regulation, right? All right, let's talk about non-negotiable, the do no harm statutory framework. 1 accountability test for degree programs and graduate certificates, right? So if you've got an undergraduate degree program, a graduate degree program, or a graduate cert, it is subject to the earnings premium test that's in the statute, right? And the statute talks about how that test works and where the data is, how you determine, the median earnings for an institution's completers, and how you determine the earnings threshold that has to compete with or beat. The other thing that's in the statutory framework is the loss of direct loans for all failing programs that are covered under the statutory framework. So let me say this again. This is in statute. And Congress said, we're going to create an earnings, just one test, an earnings premium test. We're going to apply it to all undergraduate degree and graduate degree programs and graduate certs. All right. We're going to tell you the data points and how to calculate them and how the test works. And if you have a program that fails any of these, then they lose direct loan eligibility. This was non-negotiable. So I'm going to show you some slides later that talk about the impact of the accountability framework that's been proposed by the department. And what I just want folks to understand, when we talk about the impact of the proposed accountability framework on degree programs and graduate degree programs and graduate certs, that's mostly statutory. And the reason I highlight that is so that you understand that the negotiators, we weren't negotiating this piece, right? Because it's in statute. The department didn't have the authority to negotiate this piece, and we didn't. What we were negotiating and voting on for consensus was the regulatory package that went around these statutory concepts, right? And so that include reporting and disclosure requirements, the tests that would be applied to non-degree programs, those types of things. But the things you see on your screen right now were not negotiable. So when you're preparing your public comments, similarly, just be aware if you are taking issue with the statutory framework, you can express those concerns and dissatisfaction to the department. That is totally your right, but the department cannot move off of this statutory language. It has to implement the statutory test, mostly as they've been created by Congress. All right, so here's your negotiables and non-negotiables. Once again, just on a different slide, sort of thought of in a different visual way. Range of options. This is something else that's important to keep in mind when we're thinking about the dynamics during negotiated rulemaking. So Ed is bound to implement the do no harm statutory framework, but the department has considerable latitude in determining how to approach the reporting and disclosure requirements, program information website, and the evaluation of gainful employment programs, which is all those non-degree programs for traditional higher ed, and also to the extent they're not covered by do no harm programs, non-degree programs, and other programs offered by proprietary schools. Also keep in mind, the department could have argued to keep the existing financial value transparency and G rule in place and just layer D&H on top of it. Or it could have argued to strip gainful employment and financial value transparency off the books entirely. So the department had both of those extremes available to it. It chose to lead with a draft regulatory proposal that was more or less middle of the road. But be sure, when the department was negotiating last week and speaking with negotiators, particularly in private caucus, it would remind everyone, you may not like everything that's in this compromise proposal we offered, but keep in mind, if you are a student or legal aid or taxpayers and you're one of the negotiators that felt like the department's proposal should be much stricter, the department would remind you it doesn't have to do anything at all. And if you were one of the institutions that wanted more flexibility in some of the middle of the road proposal, the department also was quick to remind that they could just leave the existing regulation on the books as it's written. So, you know, there was a lot of dynamic there going on behind the scenes and some in front of the cameras when the negotiations were occurring. All right, so let's talk about the draft proposal that the department has put forward. I'm going to start by giving you sort of a high-level view, and then we're going to get into details later on. First of all, they've sort of reorganized the regulations. This isn't every regulatory section that was discussed, but it's most of them. You've still got your definitions in the consumer information website that are up here in 668.2 and 668.43. And then they've renamed what used to be the financial value and transparency section to the student tuition and transparency system, or the STATS system. They love their acronyms in DC. And it is basically a rewriting of financial value transparency, integrating various elements for the do no harm framework. And then they have earnings accountability. So subpart S used to be called gainful employment programs. But this administration, as you'll see on the next slide, its policy view is we're going to have one test and one framework for all Title IV programs across the United States. So we're going to take the do no harm things that Congress gave us, which apply to degree and graduate degree, undergrad and graduate degree programs. We're going to basically take those same concepts and apply them to non-degree programs, and we're going to have one streamlined sort of standard and approach for all Title IV programs. And the way they've renamed and reordered the regulatory text itself in the sections reflects this, right? So you've got now the student tuition and transparency system, or STAT system, that focuses on the calculation of the rates and the disclosure of information. And then you've got earnings accountability, which basically tells you what the sanctions are for programs, all Title IV programs, that fail to meet the requisite earnings premium test. Here's the policy framework. That was the regulatory stuff for the lawyer types, right? But this is practically speaking what's going on here. So disclosure and reporting requirements, I'm going to walk through them in a minute, largely maintains the significant reporting and disclosure requirements for all institutions included in the current financial value transparency and gainful employment framework. So if you've been working through all that reporting over the last year, most of it is untouched. And the department in some of its literature sort of talked about how it had lightened the load a little bit. But I'll just say, as an institution guy, it looks to me to be more or less maintained, and there's even some additional different reporting, right? The department under this proposal would also require all institutions to report all Title IV programs on their e-card, right? So this is new if you are in traditional higher ed, meaning you're a private, nonprofit, or a public. If you're not on provisional certification or otherwise subject to some sort of particular directive from the department, typically when you add a new program, a degree program, non-degree, you have to report. But if it's a new degree program, you don't have to put it on your e-card, meaning you don't have to submit it through the department's electronic application system. Now you would have to do that on a go-forward basis. It's unclear, but it does not seem to me that the intent or the regulatory text requires you to go back and add all your existing programs. But on a go-forward basis, anytime you want a new program to be eligible for direct loans, you're going to have to put it on your e-card. So like I say, that's a pretty big lift for a lot of institutions. The program information website remains intact, largely maintains all the publishing requirements as required under the existing regulation, although there are some small variations there as well. There is one earnings premium test for all Title IV programs. So the department has gotten rid of the debt to earnings test that was part of the existing financial value transparency rule, right? But it requires, under the proposal, the department to subject every Title IV program to the earnings premium test that is in the D&H framework, the do no harm framework that's in statute, right? The EP test for non-degree and undergraduate programs is a little different from the EP test for graduate degree programs, and I'll talk you through that in a little bit. And finally, you now have sanctions for all Title IV programs, not just non-degree gainful employment programs, but the sanction for the most part is limited to the loss of direct loan eligibility, whereas previously under the gainful employment framework that is still in regulation today, if a gainful employment program fails, it loses all Title IV eligibility. Now, please keep in mind, I'll walk through this in a minute too, Pell eligibility can also be lost for all failing programs if the number of failing programs exceeds certain thresholds. And they're pretty high thresholds. And the idea is if you have a certain number of failing thresholds, you're actually getting into the territory of failing administrative capability and lacking financial responsibility. So it's just a different type of consideration. So this is the proposed framework. Also, I just want to emphasize again, the proposed text that we saw is draft text. It is a proposal in the strictest sense, but this is draft regulatory text. Just to be clear, the U.S. Department of Education has not yet issued its proposed rule. It's going to take this draft text, and we expect in the next couple, 3 months, you're going to see an official notice of proposed rulemaking, and that will be the actual proposed rule. Then you'll have a comment period. Then you'll see the final rule after that. This gets us to our first secret word, which is EAGLE. It's item number C on your screen. If you are an attorney type looking for continuing legal education, please, please, please take a minute and click C so you can get your continuing legal education brownie points, which we very much want you to get. And while you're doing that, I'm just going to take a brief sip of tea. It's the spot every time. All right, I'll wait just a second or two. Just by way of preview, I'm going to start talking here in a minute about projections. And, most of you, I assume if you're tuning in, it's because you perceive that there is significant importance potentially to this rule, which I think there most certainly is, particularly for certain types of programs. But I didn't want to bury the projections until the very end. I wanted you to see them up front so you can get a sense of how this thing's going to be impactful. And also what you can start doing right away, because there are data sets that are already made available to get a sense as to how it might affect your institution and programs quite specifically. All right. I think we're just about there. I hope everybody who's an attorney type was able to click. Let's keep moving. So let's talk about projected impact. The slides I'm going to show you next are slides that I pulled from the U.S. Department of Education's own presentations to the negotiators. So what happened was the department created its own data set. You may remember the Biden administration did a similar kind of thing. So the department has created what it calls the PPD 26, right? So this is projected performance data for this for 2026 It's program level data set that includes performance information for nearly all Title IV programs offered at U.S. colleges in the United States. If you pull up this data set, it has every institution listed. Now, one thing you need to understand is when the department actually runs these numbers in the future and actually implements this thing, programs are still defined as at the 6-digit zip code level. This data set is at the 4-digit zip code level. So what that means is, if you're not familiar, every program that's approved by an institution of higher education has a 6-digit zip code assigned to it, right? And then there's a 4-digit root and a 2-digit root. And as you move back to the 4-digit root, for example, you'd have a group of programs that are all sort of similar kinds of programs that would all have that same 4-digit root. So when the department ran these numbers, they're at the 4-digit level. What that means is, if you look at the department's data set and you see that 4 digits and it says your program is failing, you might have 2 programs that are part of that single determination. And you might have one program that has 20 students in it that actually has really strong earnings, and another program that has 100 students in it that has not so strong earnings. And, you just need to be mindful. It may be that the smaller program is fine. And when it actually, these all get tested as individual programs, which is going to happen, they may not both fail. So I just want to be really clear. This was done at the 4-digit zip code level. But for a lot of institutions, you may only have one program in that 4-digit zip. So you'll know this is our program that fits there, right? It's very important data for everyone to look at. Here are, and they're estimates, it's an estimated data set, but it is unquestionably the most recent, and it's the only data set publicly available that uses the proposed methodology. About 6% of all higher education programs will fail the earnings test in the proposed rule, about 6%. About 5% of Title IV students attend programs that fail the earnings test in the proposed rule, and I'm going to show you some charts in a minute here. A majority, approximately 55% of students in failing programs attend for-profit institutions because failure is much higher at non-degree programs. About 1 in 3 or 31% of students in undergraduate certificate programs attend a program that fails the earning test in the proposed rule. Let me say that again. About 31% of students in undergraduate certificate programs in the United States attend a program that fails under the proposed draft text. Fields of study that are particularly hard hit, and this is an important idea around this whole conversation, is that it's not as if every program is equally impacted and there are certain, everyone's worst versions of, it's like the worst engineering and the worst accounting and that's not how this works. It has a disproportional impact on certain types of programs, and we're going to see that in a minute, right? But at the top of the list are culinary, cosmetology, drama and fine arts, religious studies, and alternative and complementary medicine. If you offer a program that is in one of these areas, you and your colleagues in your space need to be paying very close attention to this. I know many of you are already, but if you happen to be watching this webinar now or later and you're not aware of this rule and this is the type of programming you offer, you need to get keyed into this right away. Also, some states, including Florida, Louisiana, Tennessee, California, and Idaho, have a much higher share of programs that are failing. So let's look at some of the charts. First of all, by the way, this is program weighted, this particular chart. So this is the percentage of failing programs. Many of the later slides are student weighted, which is showing you the percentage of students in failing programs. But this is actually percentage of failing programs. It's 5.8, right? We talked about that a minute ago, which means 94.2% of programs that are out there should pass these tests, right? Should pass these tests. Here it is broken down. This is still program weighted. It's broken down by credential level. You can see there's a disproportionate number of undergraduate certificates. By the way, that's not surprising. I mean, this is, and then you'll see a little jump over there by masters, but particularly for undergraduate certificates, these are very short programs. Sometimes they could be, 6 months or 8 months, and their graduates are often making lower earnings. And the entire basis for this test is how much people are making 4 years after they graduate from your program. That is the only criterion that we're talking about in this entire thing. It's not lifetime financial value. It's not value-added earnings. It's not social value. It's not the quality of your instructors or your program, none of that. It's just how much people are making 4 years out. So if you have a very short workforce type program and people graduate and they don't make a lot of money, particularly 3 or 4 years out, or if you have a program where people do a lot of gig work after they graduate, or a lot of your graduates are self-employed or starting small businesses where they're putting a lot of the money back into the business, all of those things can absolutely impact performance. And I think you're going to see that on the subsequent slides. Students in failing programs by sector, you can see about half, 45% are in nonprofit public programs, and about 55% are in for-profit programs. That represents about 650,000 Title IV students right now. So 650,000 Title IV students are projected right now to be in programs that are failing. Here's the failure rates by state. My home state, Louisiana, is number one. I made the joke, it's nice to finally be number one in something. It'd be nice if it wasn't this. And you'll see, interestingly enough, you have a fairly strong representation from the Deep South and South in the left-hand side of this chart, with Mississippi, Florida, Arkansas, Tennessee, Texas, Georgia, Virginia, all being, and South Carolina, all being on the left-hand side. Right. And you know, the southeastern region of the United States tends to have lower earnings than some of the other regions of the United States. So it's not necessarily surprising that you would see that. Really important. So again, this rule is not going to impact all programs equally. It's going to disproportionately impact certain types of programs, right? Particularly programs with, we think, generally that produce graduates who have lower earnings. But also, if you've got high percentage of women or minorities who may be subject to wage discrimination, if you've got a situation where you're getting stuck with the national median as opposed to a state level median, and that, you know, and you'll see in a minute, the idea is if most of your students are in your state, you should have the state level median earnings. But what can happen is, let's say one of our negotiators is at a school where they have multiple campuses. All those campuses are in the Southeast, with the result that they are all in states with the earnings that are likely lower than the national median earnings. But because more than 50% of the students for the institution, which is the whole OPID, are spread around multiple states, they're going to get the national earnings metric when they get evaluated at any rate. So let's talk about what we're seeing here on the screen. This is for undergraduate certificate programs. 100% of Title IV students in undergraduate certificate programs in culinary entertainment fail the proposed rule. If you offer a culinary program, remember, this is publics, private nonprofits, for-profits. This is everybody that's going into these numbers, right? 100% Title IV students in undergraduate certificate programs. This is student weighted, not program weighted. So we're talking about the percentage of students in failing programs. For English language and literature, 98.9. Computer information sciences and support services, 95.9. Cosmetology, 92.5%. Massage therapy, so you're talking about somatic body work, related therapeutic services, 89%. Human development, family studies, and related services. So we think a lot of programs that deal with particularly like early childhood development, things like that, where folks are going and they're becoming preschool teachers, things of that nature, are going to be pretty hard hit. Radio, television, dental support services, business operations support and assistance services. Everything on this screen is at over 50%, right? So if you have a significant percentage of your students at your institution are in these programs, you really need to be thoughtful about starting now to try to develop strategies. You know, the other thing I want to comment right now is, I know a lot of folks, we've had 15 years that we've been talking about accountability, and you've had rules proposed and then courts come along and knock them out, and then, you know, they get proposed again, and then there's litigation. And it would not be surprising to me and not unjustified for folks to say, should I really be that concerned about this? My answer to you is that this is different. You have much of this hard-coded in statute. You had the Democrats and the Financial Value Transparency and Gainful Employment Rule who supported an earnings premium test. Then you have the Republicans and the Do No Harm Framework who supported an earnings premium test. That means you've got bipartisan support for the application of an earnings premium test to institutions and their programs. And much of this framework is in statute. I think you have to treat this differently. And I really urge folks, particularly if you see things on this screen that you think you're going to impact your institution or program specifically, to jump on this now. Let's talk about associate degree programs. Similarly, you see massage therapy and cosmetology at the very top of the list. 100% of the students in associate degree programs in those areas are in programs that are failing right now. And then you see a lot of arts. Film, video, photographic arts, fine and studio arts, visual and performing arts, graphic communications, music, audiovisual communications, design and applied arts. You've got folks who are graduating with associate degrees and then, waiting tables and trying to make their break or doing gig work and things of that nature. And those folks either simply aren't making very much, maybe not consistently reporting their income, et cetera. And in cosmetology and massage therapy, you probably have a significant amount, or at least meaningful amount, of tip income that may not be reported as well. And all of that hurts these programs. Bachelor's degree programs. So the good news here is there are very few bachelor's degree programs that are even over 20%. In fact, there's only one, and that's religion and religious studies, which is at 53%. So what that means, again, is across all religion programs in the United States, if you got a bachelor's degree in religion or religious studies, right? 53% of the Title IV students out there in these programs are in programs that are failing. So this is a significant issue for this particular program sector. And a lot of these graduates, and 4 years after they graduate, may be on missions, they may be doing work for nonprofits, or in areas where they're simply not making very much money. They may have continuing studies that aren't at Title IV institutions, and that involve stipends or parsonages or things like that, where it's not getting into their earnings and showing up. So this is going to be one the religious studies folks are going to have to be very thoughtful about this, and should publicly comment, by the way, keeping in mind, though, that this is baked into the statute, the test for bachelor's degree programs. Again, we see graphic communications, a lot of arts, music. It is cold comfort if you are at a failing music program, but I'm grateful at least that the damage for most of these programs, you're looking at 11%, 11%, 12%, and not 50 or 60 or 70. Master's degree programs, alternative and complementary medicine and medical systems. I was chatting with someone this morning at a trade association that has a lot of these schools and their programs. If you have a program that fits into this 4-digit SIP, and I think you probably know who you are, you should certainly double check. 98% of Title IV students that are in these programs are in programs that are failing. So this is a huge problem for these master's programs. For religion and religion studies, master's programs, 89% of the students are in programs that are failing. Mental and social health services and allied professions, 64%, and then fine and studio arts and music. My mother is a graduate of a master's in music program. And by the way, not to pick on any one institution, but just to highlight, Juilliard has a failing program. This is not a measure of the quality of programs or the quality of institutions. It's about how much money your students are making 4 years after they graduate. And I deeply appreciate that many of us think that is not a particularly good way to measure the value of an academic program. For me, it's akin to asking someone to rate their 4 best meals of their life based on the calories in those meals. Most of us would say that's missing the point. But this is the statutory test that's in place. And my strong advice to folks is to sort of internalize this, start studying this rule, get with your teams, and start working on potential solutions. You can find the PPD 26 data set right now on the department's website. If it's that website for negotiated rulemaking for higher education, that's the main link. I've also given you the link at the bottom here on the left where it says you can get the spreadsheet by clicking this link. There are a bunch of spreadsheets. There's a code book and things to help you understand the spreadsheets. But the actual spreadsheet with the fail rates by program and school, if you click that link, you'll get it. It's a very large document. You'll probably need to download it. I couldn't even download it in my browser. It was too big. But if you download it to your computer, you can bring it up. I've also shown you, if you go to the department's negotiated rulemaking website with the arrow here, this is the specific spreadsheet you want. It's the one that's at that link, but it also shows you all the others. If you're planning to, take all this and hand it over to your informational, institutional analytical folks at your institution, then just show them this whole section with all these spreadsheets, and they can download all this stuff and start crunching the numbers for you. So let's take a deep breath. I got an hour and 15 minutes, and I want to walk you through some of the fineries of this rule. The first thing I'm going to do is, I thought the easiest way to give you a sense as to the changes for the reporting and disclosure requirements was actually to show you, which are minor, was to show you the existing reporting and disclosure requirements that are already in the regulation and that many of you have been contending with over the last year, and then show you where the revisions are, right? So generally speaking, institutions are still required to report a wide range of data to the department. There was not, again, some of the rhetoric around the rule suggested there might be a lot of relief there. As a practical matter, I think the relief is modest. These reporting obligations still generally fall into 3 categories: Title IV program data, data for all students, and then data specifically for completed and withdrawn students, sort of by category. And of course, the department continues to retain the right to collect any other information they think is needed. So there is that sort of catch-all. The scope of the data production will still far exceed what's required to calculate the earnings premium. In fact, the department needs almost nothing from you to actually calculate the earnings premium. I mean, all they need is your completers list, because they're going to pull the earnings data from the IRS likely. And then the other data point we'll talk about later comes from the American Community Survey, which is managed by the Census Bureau. So all this stuff they're asking for is not what they need for the test. Sometimes people will reach out to me and they'll say, oh, can you try to get the department to get rid of all this extraneous stuff? They don't need it. No, they're aware of that. Please understand, they want all of this other data because they want to disclose more on their program information website, and also generally because I think they like having data about institutions. Under the existing financial value, transparency, and gainful employment rule, an institution is not required to report if it's not offered any group of substantially similar programs with 30 or more completers over the last 4 award years. The department proposes to eliminate this exemption. One of the things that they're really trying to do is to get at every program. And one of the problems with prior accountability frameworks has been that really small programs never get measured. Congress in the Do No Harm statutory framework told the department that it wanted it to sort of go about aggregating cohorts and trying to get around this to make sure that every program gets measured. So consistent with that, the department here has decided that it needs to strike this sort of small program, small cohort exemption that existed in the rule. So now what I'm walking you through, what you see on your screen, the black, it's like a red line. If you're a lawyer type, you're familiar with these. The black represents reporting requirements that are already in the regulation and that the department proposes to keep. And then you can see the red stripes are the things they are going to line out, and the blue is something new, right? So as you can see, first of all, most of this is still on the boards. They've done a little refining around licensure requirements, professional licensure requirements. They just want you to disclose the states where your program meets professional licensure requirements, consistent with the statutory or the regulatory obligation that already exists in different parts of the law. And then at the bottom, they've struck whether a program is a qualifying graduate program. I won't bury the lead on this. I'm going to talk about it a little later, but the department has eliminated the concept of qualifying graduate program. Let me say that again. If you have a graduate program, including a medical program or any other sort of program that has a clinical experience required on the other side of graduation, the department's view is we're not measuring earnings until 4 years after someone has graduated, and these types of programs should be able to meet these benchmarks. The thresholds are low enough, it shouldn't be a problem. Now, during NEGREG, I specifically asked the department, have you run the data, or can you run the data and let us know how many of the programs that were previously would have qualified as a qualifying graduate program you project are going to fail this test? And the department did not have that data. So we don't know. But the expectation is that because the earnings premium, the earnings thresholds are lower, that these programs won't have a problem. That being said, if you have a program that you think is a qualifying graduate program under current law, you should go look at the PPD 26 data set and see if it has flagged you as a failing program. This might be a place where public comment can make a difference between the proposed and final rule. Okay. This is data that you're currently required to produce for all students. Again, you can see the department struck a couple of things. Both of these, attendance dates and enrollment status, they struck because they think they can get it from NSLDS. So they're still going to pull that data. They just don't think they need you to produce it. And then the rest is just refining current requirements slightly. There's really no elimination of reporting obligations. Here, again, this is part 2 of all the things you have to report already for students under the current regulation. As you can see, once again, there are some slight revisions, but generally all of these requirements continue to be present. These are the things that you have to report specifically around people who completed or withdrew and sort of based on the completion or withdrawal status. Again, you can see the only 2 things that were actually struck is the date the student completed or withdrew, which the department believes it already have, and the total amount of institutional debt the student owes any party after completing or withdrawing from the program, because there's no longer a debt to earnings rate. And so the department is no longer trying to capture that specific sort of component of debt. But the department has added that they want you to report now going forward the total amount of federal, state, private, and other grants and scholarships provided for the student's entire enrollment in the program. And several institutional commenters made the note that this isn't necessarily easy. You already sort of have some obligation, right, as a financial aid department to try to understand when this is the case, but you also can't guarantee that you will always know. I mean, theoretically, someone could get a loan and show up and hand you the cash, and you might not know it's actually a private loan. So, there was some discussion around this, but the department at the end of the day felt like it really needed this data point because they do intend to still calculate median debt and make that information publicly available, even though the debt is not part of a debt to earnings rate metric that has to be passed. The department also proposes to clarify in the regulation that institutional grants and scholarships do not include federal education benefits, state, tribal, local, private grants and scholarships, and some other things. This, as the department observed, is an attempt to clarify types of assistance that aren't considered institutional grants and scholarships, and also is consistent with sub-regulatory guidance. By the way, when I say something like the department observes, and I have quotes, you can find this, it's publicly available on the NEGREG website. When the department gave us its draft proposal, throughout it had comments, it's like a Word document with comment bubbles, offering explanation as to why it had made some of the changes or proposed some of the changes that it was proposing. And that's what I'm citing as some of their commentary text here. Reporting timeframes under the new rule, very similar to the current rule. So by October 1st of the year the regulations take effect, which we can talk about that in a minute, institutions would be required to report all required data for the 2 most recently completed award years. So for example, if the regulations took effect July 1, 2026, data for AY 24-25 and AY 25-26 would be due by October 1st. Thereafter, on October 1st of each year, you have to report the most recent award year. If you fail to report the requisite data because for some reason you don't have it, you have to provide a suitable explanation to the department, suitable in their estimation, I should say. By the way, it is the department's intent, I think, to try to take the position that these regulations will be effective July 1 of this year. And I anticipate that they will be asking institutions to report this data by October 1st. There may be folks who challenge that. The statutory language in the Do No Harm Act, or it's not the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, but in the Do No Harm section of that act, does take effect July 1, 2026. But it's not everything that takes effect. It's like some very specific things that are supposed to be taking effect. Schools have to make a certain certification by July 1, 2026. The department seems to acknowledge that there are some things that are effective July 1, 2026 that they and schools will be bound to, and that there are other things that they're proposing in this regulation that would not become effective until July 1, 2027. But I anticipate and so there's sort of this question about, what's effective July 1, 26, what can't be effective until July 1, 27. But my expectation is the department's going to try to get an interim final rule before July 1, 27, in fact, this year. And they will elect to be bound by the interim final rule. And I think they will also be pushing institutions to report data, keeping in mind that the current financial value transfer and gainful employment rule is already on the books, continues to be the law of the land, and requires reporting. So it's going to be hard, I think, as an institution to argue you don't have any obligation to report. I mean, there is a regulation, and until the department's new law becomes effective and takes effect, even if that is July 1, 27, the existing law and all those reporting requirements are still on the books. So I would plan to be reporting data this coming October 1st. Okay. The elimination of transitional reporting, because there's no debt to earnings rate and no debt element, this is just all about earnings. The department has got rid of the whole transitional reporting concept. So that's out the window. You're not reporting 7 or 8 back years. You're just reporting 2 most recent award years of data this coming October 1st. And after that, it'll just be 1 most recent award year of data. I talked about the elimination of the qualified graduate program earlier. You can see in the second bullet, this was the explanation they offered in the documents they provided us. The qualified graduate program is used to extend the time between grad and earnings measurement for certain individuals. To harmonize the GE requirements with the One Big Beautiful Bill accountability framework, this concept would no longer be used, because their view is the Do No Harm framework, which is true in statute, specifies the interval between graduation and when earnings are supposed to be measured, and it's consistent. The statute has no exception for qualified graduate program. And keep in mind, when you're talking about graduate programs, that's all covered by statute. There really isn't a non-degree component. So I made the point earlier, if you are commenting on statutory concepts, you may be, it's the proverbial fighting against the windmills, right? But I think it is still worth talking about this if you are finding that you have a qualified graduate program that is failing. All Title IV programs are on the e-car. I mentioned this earlier, and this is the language. By the way, for most of this, where I could, in the lower right-hand corner, I gave you the citation, but I put draft in front because, in mind, again, this is a draft regulatory proposal. It's not in the law yet. So if you go to the EFCR and look this up, you're not going to find it. You got to look it up in the draft proposal that the department put on this website. Let's talk about disclosures and distributions. Similarly, I mentioned earlier the department would still maintain the new program information website. They got rid of the requirement that it be up and running by July 1, 26. So it'll just be whenever they can get it up and running. Still unclear how this would integrate, or if it would integrate with College Navigator, Scorecard, iPads, etc. Much like the prior section, what I'm showing you here is all the things that are required under the existing financial value transparency and gainful employment rule and the modifications the department proposed in its text. As you can see, almost nothing, right? In fact, all they did was they got rid of debt to earnings rates, which they're no longer calculating, and they actually added a new data element as calculated by the department. The website would also include the median length of calendar time taken for full and less than full-time students to complete the program. By the way, I'll also point you to the bottom here, the third from the bottom bullet, as calculated by ED, the median earnings for completers or completers and withdrawals during a period determined by the department. So this is all information that, per the regulatory language, must be on the program information website. And I'm just highlighting that it's not changing much. In fact, you have an additional data point here. And this is data that is optional per the regulation the department could include on that website. And here you only see one thing that's been struck. That's whether the program graduates must complete a postgraduate training and obtain licensure. And the reason they needed that data point was to determine if a program was a qualified graduate program. So since that concept was deleted, they no longer needed this data point. Okay. The department did not totally eliminate the obligation that you have a prominent link. Initially, they had, during negotiations, legal aid and other negotiators pushed to have this put back in. The department sort of met them halfway. They put it back in, but they did delete academics. So the idea here is you're supposed to include a link to the department's new program information website on any web page on your institution's website containing, and what it used to say was academic cost, financial aid, or admissions information about the program or institution. Well, we pointed out as institutions, academic cost, financial aid, or admissions information about the institution is on almost every page of the website. The department felt like pulling academic off was shrinking the box considerably. I mean, cost, financial aid, and admissions is in sort of more discrete sections, and they thought that was manageable, I think. Direct distribution requirements still remain. So you still have an obligation per these requirements to provide links and information regarding the program information website to prospective students and currently enrolled students. Okay, here's our second secret word, and it is bear, as in this proposal is a real bear. That is A, the first radio button. And I would be grateful if you are an attorney type, if you would please click on A and make sure that you get your continuing education credit. Always a good idea if you're here, among other things, for that credit. And what I'm going to do next here while you guys are clicking is we're going to get into the earnings premium test. So the one big test that's now going to be applied to everybody, and try to give you a sense of like the particular mechanics. This stuff can get pretty complicated. I mean, I'm someone who's been nosing around in it for 15 years, but I appreciate, for those of you who don't do this for a living, it can be a lot. Just keep in mind this recording is going to be available. You've got the slides. I'm going to go through it I'll try to do sort of a medium clip, but you've got the ability to come back and look through this and take more time to absorb it, et cetera. And certainly for those of you who are clients or non-clients, if you'd like to talk about it, you are always welcome to give me a ring. That's what we're here for. Okay. So hopefully folks have had an opportunity. It seems like we're getting pretty close to our benchmark percentage. I usually try to watch. It tells me what percentage of folks have responded. So I think we're there. Okay, let's keep moving. Overview of the earnings premium test. Keep in mind, under this proposal, once again, we now have one test, one test to bind them all. Yes, that was a Lord of the Rings reference. So first of all, very important, the department has eliminated the debt to earnings rate test. It is no longer present in the proposal anywhere. It's just one test, and that's a straight earnings premium test. This is a really important modification to the existing framework under the current regulation. There's also been some elimination of exemptions. So the department proposes to eliminate the general exemption for right now for institutions located in U.S. territories or freely associated states. However, what the department does say is if the Census Bureau data required to calculate the earnings threshold, so that's not your median earnings for your graduates, that's that other benchmark against which your graduates' earnings are going to be compared. So by the way, just going forward, median annual earnings, I'm talking about for year completers. Earnings threshold, we're talking about the benchmark against which they're going to be compared. And the earnings premium test is that test. We're comparing those two numbers, right? So the department's going to get, I'll talk about this in a minute, but they're going to get the data to calculate the earnings threshold, the benchmark from the Census Bureau. And what they've said is if Census Bureau data isn't available for the territory or freely associated state, no calculation will be performed. As a practical matter, I think what this means is Puerto Rico has data and they will have rates calculated and be subject to the test. Most of the freely associated states and other territories, I don't think have sufficient data. I'm not sure about that. It should certainly be confirmed, but in the conversations we were having, that's where it seemed to sort of to land. The department also would eliminate the exemption for institutions that have not offered any group of substantially similar programs with 30 or more completers over the four most recent award years. I mentioned that earlier, but I just want to highlight it again here. So let's talk about the earnings premium test at a high level, and then I'm going to start breaking down the components for you. So the earnings premium test would apply again to all Title IV programs. No one is exempt. Now, if you have non-Title, people always ask me these questions, but if you have non-Title IV programs, that means it does not apply to your non-Title IV coding bootcamp. But if it's a Title IV program, whether it's non-degree, undergraduate degree, graduate cert, if it's a Title IV program, it is covered. Both GE and non-GE programs would still be identified by a combination of 6-digit OPID numbers, so that's how we know the institution. And within that institution, the program is 6-digit zip code and credential level. That's essentially the definition of a program for purposes of all of this. Each year, the department would calculate an earnings premium, right? So it runs this test for each Title IV program. The earnings premium equals the median annual earnings, that's your completers, minus the earnings threshold, that's the benchmark. And you pass if your folks are equal to or more than the benchmark, right? So a program passes the earnings premium test if its median annual earnings equals or exceeds the earnings threshold. If a program fails once in 3 years, the institution would be required to issue a warning to students in the program. So you saw the programs that are likely to fail. If you fail 1 year under this test, the first year they run it, if you fail, you have to start making warnings. So you need to tell your vice presidents of enrollment and admissions folks and whoever is thinking about strategy and program, all those types of things. 1 year warnings to students, and you're telling them and prospective students, among other things, you may not have direct loans a year from now. If a program fails twice in a 3-year period, it would become a low earning outcome program and lose access to direct loans. That's graduate programs, that's master's, that's doctoral, that's bachelor's degrees. It does not matter. If you are a Title IV program covered by this test and you fail twice, your students will lose access to direct loans. So this is the wrinkle that we negotiated on the last day. So there were people who wanted loss of Pell Grants to be on the table. In other words, they said, if you fail twice, you should lose Pell Grants too. And then there were institutional representatives that said, no, we still need the Pell Grant. For example, we've got these early childhood learning programs. We're producing preschool teachers. You know, a lot of the public community colleges and public schools said, look, with a Pell Grant, we can still offer this program. Without a Pell Grant, it becomes a real problem. And we need nursery school teachers, right? Or preschool teachers. So we hit a middle ground. There's already a provision in the law that says, and the department was going to update it, and there's another one in financial responsibility, but in administrative capability, there's already a provision that says, if 50% or more of an institution's Title IV recipients are in, or 50% or more of an institution's Title IV funds are from failing programs, these are low earning outcome programs, then the institution would fail administrative capability. That actually is already in the current law. It's specific to gainful employment programs, but the concept's already in 668.16T, as in time. If an institution were to fail this new standard now under this new construct, in 2 out of any 3 consecutive award years, the institution would be placed on a provisional status, and the institution's low earning outcome programs would lose access to all Title IV funds, including Pell Grants. Okay, so let me explain this, how it would work. My program fails year 1. If you fail the first year, you are not a low earning outcome program. You only become a low earning outcome program and lose direct loan access if you fail 2 out of 3 years. Okay. So let's say you fail 2 out of 3 years. You have that second fail. Now you're a low earning outcome program. Now let's say when that happened, your institution offers 10 programs, right? And 65% of your students are in and receiving funds, right, north of this 50% mark in the failing programs. So here it's more than 50%. Let's say you've got after 2 years have gone by, like 65% of your programs are low earning outcome programs. Okay. Now that would have to be true another year. You'd have to be a low earning outcome program above these thresholds 2 years in a row to actually get to this administrative capability point and lose Pell Grant funding. So I know this is kind of hard to visualize, but you would basically have your programs would have to fail at a minimum 3 years in a row. And in year 2 and year 3, the rate of failure has to be, again, more than 50% of your institution's Title IV recipients have to be in, or 50% of your funds be coming from these low earning outcomes programs. So if you're an institution with 100 programs and you've got 5 programs failing, it's unlikely you're ever going to get there. And what that means is if you're a community college and you've got that, early childhood learning program, you might lose direct loan eligibility, but you would probably still have Pell Grant funding. If you are a cosmetology school and you have 1 program, this is a problem, right? Because in the 3rd year you fail, not only are you going to lose their direct loan, but you're also going to lose Pell Grant. And this is going to be similar probably for some seminaries, for some acupuncture schools, institutions that only have 1 or 2 or 3 programs. This becomes a bigger problem for them. And we knew that, but we were trying to keep in mind as negotiators for institutions, our goal was to try to find a midway point so that everybody was not losing Pell Grant eligibility as soon as they failed twice, right? And this was kind of the order of magnitude risk allocation mechanism that we came up with. Here's the annual process overview. The department would compile a program, the completers list for each of your programs. After it sort of gets the cohort together, you get an opportunity to review and respond on that completers list. Once that gets set, it gets sent over to the earnings agency. That's not specified in the regs, but the department's made it pretty clear they like the IRS for this. Once that earnings information is received, the department does its calculations and issues a notice of determination to the school. The institution can accept that determination, appeal, or in some cases initiate a voluntary teach out. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. So let's break down the earnings premium test a little bit more. First of all, what are the tests themselves? They're different for undergraduate and non-degree programs and for graduate degree programs. So for Title IV programs granting a baccalaureate or lesser credential, which could include non-degree programs, you've got your median annual earnings on one side, right? That's the median annual earnings of your working completers who graduated. It's going to be 4 years before the determination year. The department at the last minute, I have 3 to 4, but it's going to be 4. The earnings threshold is the median annual earnings of working adults aged 25 to 34 who only have a high school diploma or its recognized equivalent. So that's the benchmark against which your completers' earnings are being measured. For graduate degrees, the median annual earnings side of the equation looks basically the same. Again, it's the median annual earnings of working completers who graduated about 4 years before the determination. But the earnings threshold now is the median annual earnings of working adults aged 25 to 34 who have a bachelor's degree, right? So if I've got a master's degree program or a PhD program, I'm not competing against folks with only a high school diploma. I'm competing against everyone who's got a bachelor's degree, either in the United States or in the state where I'm located. How do you know whether it's the whole United States or the state in which you're located? To do that, we're going to have to get even deeper into the weeds. So first of all, let's talk about your side of the equation, the median annual earnings of your working completers. So here's what we're talking about. For all Title IV programs, the median annual earnings would be based on the median earnings for working completers, which are students who completed the program during the applicable cohort period, received some form of Title IV aid, are working, which is different from the current regulation. So this is strictly focused on working, and don't otherwise fall into an excluded category. These are the students who would appear on your completers list. Let's talk about the cohort period, because this is a sticky wicket. So the department proposes to begin by only looking at the earnings of students who completed during a single award year. And the initial single year cohort would be the 4th award year prior to the calendar year for which the most recent earnings data is available. Don't worry, charts are coming. This would mean if the most recent year for which earnings data is available is calendar year 2025, that the initial single cohort would be made up of students who completed during the 2021 award year. Okay. This is what it looks like. This is the department slide. So what you see is, and this is what they expect is going to happen. They're going to start crunching numbers. They're going to get data in late 26. They hope to crunch the first round of numbers in the spring of 27, right? They're going to use earnings data from calendar year 25. And that's going to be for folks who graduated during the 2020-2021 award year. And you can see how that lays out here. But what if you don't have enough people in the single cohort, right? And a lot of programs won't. And remember, one of the things Congress really wanted to accomplish here is they didn't want programs not being tested, which was the problem with all these programs with small cohorts. So if the initial single year cohort has fewer than 30 completers, the department would extend the cohort for the program 1 year at a time until it reaches the 30 completer threshold. So it's still doing with the 6-digit zip code. We're just looking at your program, but we're going to start going back in time 1 year at a time, up to 4 additional award years in the expansion. If you still don't have 30, then the department's going to pull all the programs at your institution with the same 4-digit zip code, and it's going to jump back to 2021. And 1 year at a time, it's going to start pulling in completers for the programs with the same 4-digit zip code. But Aaron, you say, are you telling me that we're going to include earnings for people who graduated from a different program? Yes, that is what I'm telling you. And then if the department gets all the way back to the 8th prior award year, which is 16-17, it still doesn't have 30 people. It's going to go back to 2021. It's going to expand to the 2-digit zip code and start pulling in earnings for everyone in the 2-digit zip code in your institution. All those programs are in that same 2-digit zip code and working its way back 1 year at a time to try to get to 30, and it'll go all the way back to 2016, 2017. This is going to be really common because the department speculates that only about 9% of programs have greater than 30 Title IV completers in that first single year. So they expect to be aggregating, right? I think when we asked them this, I don't think we got a really clear answers. If we did, I don't remember it. But, you know, I don't think they expect to be going into the 4-digit and 2-zip, 4-digit SIP and 2-digit SIP all that often, right? I mean, a lot of times they'll be able to go back 1 or 2 or 3 years within your single 6-digit SIP programs cohort and get the 30 completers that they need. But it is also possible at times they'll have to go further back. This gives you a sense. It says the share of programs at the SIP 6 level with more than 30 completers in a single award year, and you can see it's pretty small percentages, right? This is my little chart just to try to help you visualize all of this. So the first award year for which determinations will be effective under this rule. So the department may do some of the calculations prior to the beginning of the award year to which the determination is attributed. So in other words, they might run numbers in early 27, even though the first year determination is attributed to the 27-28 award year, if that makes sense, right? But here's what we expect to happen per the department's own schedule. We think that the first award year for which determinations are going to be made and to which they will be applied is AY 27-28. The most recently available earnings will be from calendar year 25, right? So if you march backwards per prior 2 or 3 slides, first prior year, second prior year, third prior year, you can see why 2021 is the 4th prior award year. And that's that single cohort year. And then if the department needs to start sequentially expanding and aggregating the cohort, they'll march backward through 1920, 1819, 1718, 1617. And again, if they don't get to 30, they'll jump back, expand it to 4-digit SIP, do the same thing. If they still don't have 30, they'll go back, expand it to 2-digit SIP, pull in even more programs, and march backwards to 16, 17. And then if they don't have 30, they won't calculate an earnings agreement. Okay. For the students who completed the program during the cohort period, this is important. We're talking about earnings now. So we talked about how you get your completers cohort, but what year of earnings are they measuring? The department would always use the earnings for the 4th tax year following when they completed. So if we go back to this prior slide, right? So for 2021, you can see the 4th prior award year, they're using CY25, which is that 4th tax year after that award year. But what they're saying is, as we move back in time, we're not going to keep pulling from calendar year 25. So if we go back and we pull any data for that 1920 cohort, the people in 1920 who graduated during that award year, we're actually going to pull earnings data for them for 2024. And we're going to keep, we're going to keep that 4-year interval consistent as we move forward. And those earnings will then be inflation adjusted. They don't specify again where they're going to get the earnings, but they seem to like the IRS as the best possible example. So here is my very bestest effort to pull you together a chart that sort of has it all in one place. I think it's better than the department's chart, which I'm going to show you on the next slide. Although I will say Cody at the department did an incredible job with all his data and all his charts. He was a superhero throughout NegReg. So you'll see AY for which determination is effective. So I've got 27, 28 for you here. And you can see the single year cohort. We're talking about students graduating in 2021, and we're talking about earnings from 2025. If the department needs to start sequentially expanding and aggregating the cohort, you can see they'll go 1920, 1819, and work their way back. And you can see the corresponding calendar year that will earnings that will be used for the students in each one of those cohorts. What's interesting is, as you can see, if they have to go all the way back to 16, 17, they are pulling earnings from 2021, which is very close to the pandemic, right? Or during the pandemic. You can then see what it would look like in 28, 29, and 29, 30. So this gives you a sense of your cohorts and your earnings as they relate to one another. Here's the department's chart. It tracks, it's the same, but it also adds their expectations as to their timing for implementation, which is why I wanted to include it. So what you see is their hope is in 2027, right? You see, go to 2027, where it says calendar year 2027. It says colleges first notified, early 2027. So they want to crunch the numbers. They want to get your data in late 26. And, you know, you go over July 1, 26 of this year, you have to report everything on October 1st. They're going to take that data, they're going to run the numbers, and they issue determinations in spring of 27. And then that determination that you get is attributed to and becomes effective for the award year beginning July 1, 2027. So it's really the determination for the 27-28 award year, right? You can see the completer cohort used is 2020-2021, which is consistent with the prior chart. Earnings period measured is calendar year 2025 earnings. And then you see the aggregation window, which is what you saw in my prior chart. The thing I really want to highlight here is just the speed with which the department is moving to implementation. And also what this means is if they issue your first round of rates in spring of 27 and they become effective for the award year that begins July 1, 2027, and that means they're aiming to issue the second round of rates. First of all, it means that you could be putting out warnings to students as early as July 1 of next year. But it also means that in the spring of 2028, you're going to get the second year of determinations. And as early as July 1, 2028, your programs could lose access to direct loans, right? And then as early as July 1, 2029, if you have that administrative capability issue, you could further lose, your failing programs could further lose Pell Grant eligibility. It's very important to me that folks understand how quickly this is moving. Let's talk about earnings and working, because those can be squishy concepts. The draft text defines earnings as wages, income as reported to the Internal Revenue Service, which we cover tip income, and other earned income, including from self-employment. So it is the department's intent to try to capture all of that. The department does not define working in the draft regulation and explain that part of the reason their thinking is not to do that is because they want to match, when they're looking at your completers, they want to match their definition of working to whatever is available in the Census Bureau's data set. And they said that could change from one year to the next. Our intention is for these to be apples to apples, but we didn't want to put a definition in our regulation of working that would then bind us to use that concept for working and then have it be apples to oranges if the Census Bureau wasn't able to produce a similar data point, right? So I understand that concept. I'm going to talk about earnings and working in the Census Bureau data in just a minute. Excluded completers, this list is almost identical to what's in the current financial value transparency capable employment rule. And basically the department is just saying, you know, if when we get your completers list, it turns out that a student or graduate falls into one of these categories, including like they're deceased, they have total and permanent disability, et cetera, we're going to pull them out of the equation completely. They're off the completers list. They're not going to be part of the calculation. I mentioned this a minute ago, but just to be very clear, the department is proposing that it would not calculate earnings premium if after all of those aggregations, and it goes through all the cycles, we're trying to build a cohort, it still can't get to 30 or more students, no earnings premium calculated. Also, if the federal agency with earnings data doesn't provide earnings or provides earnings on 15 or fewer students for privacy reasons, again, they won't calculate an earnings premium. All right, this gets us to our third super secret word. It's Panther, which always reminds me of, I just can't help it, of Ron Burgundy Anchorman, where they have the Panther cologne, and he says, you know it's good because it's got real Panther bits. If you're not into that kind of comedy, I certainly appreciate it. But if you are, that is one of my favorite little bits. Panther is A. That's the choice. If you're an attorney type, please hit radio button A and go ahead and get your CLE credit. And we'll wait for just a second more while folks are coming online. So just to refresh, to help contextualize what we were talking about just then, remember, again, our equation has two primary components: the median earnings of your completers who are in the cohort, not excluded, and then the benchmark, the earnings threshold against which they're being compared. So the prior section, we were talking about how the department is going to calculate the median annual earnings for your completers. Now let's talk about how the department is going to calculate that other number, the benchmark, the earnings threshold against which your completers are going to be compared. All right, let's move on. So the earnings threshold. The earnings threshold for undergraduate and non-degree programs is a little different from the earnings threshold for graduate degree programs, which is why I've broken it apart. So for undergraduate and non-degree programs offered by a Title IV institution located in a state, and the reason for that language is because, remember I said the definition of state in the law includes territories and freely associated states. And so the idea is this is capturing all of those folks. But remember, we said if the Census Bureau doesn't have this data point for a state, which would essentially mean for certain territories or freely associated states, then it wouldn't be calculated. That's why it's written this way. But at any rate, the earnings threshold for undergraduate and non-degree programs will be based on the median earnings for adults aged 25 to 34 with only a high school diploma or recognized equivalent who worked and who were not enrolled in a Title IV eligible institution during the earnings year. So there is sort of a further education exclusion. For undergraduate and non-degree programs, the department would use the median earnings of working adults in the state in which the institution is located or nationally if fewer than 50% of the students enrolled in the institution during the award year for which calculations are being made are from the state where the institution is located. I want to emphasize here, we're not talking about if more or less, if fewer than 50% of your earners in the completer cohort are in or outside of your state. What we're focused on here is in 27 or early 2027, when the department's calculating the numbers, it's going to look at the enrollment at your institution and determine if fewer than 50% of the students at that point, spring 27 or late 26, whenever they're running the numbers, are in the state, are from the state where the institution is located. And by the way, we asked them how they're going to do that, and they expect to use the FAFSA as of right now. That's another sort of technical area where folks could really offer some significant public comment and where the department has a lot of discretion to decide how it's going to do this. But the key idea here is you're either getting a state level number or you're getting a national number. For graduate degrees, the earnings threshold for graduate degree programs offered by a Title IV institution in a state would be based on the median earnings for adults 25 to 34 with only a bachelor's degree who worked and weren't enrolled in a Title IV institution during the earnings year, the year for which earnings are being measured. But this is a much more nuanced approach to determining the benchmark. So stick with me. For graduate degree programs, if 50% or more of the students enrolled in the institution during the award year for which calculations are made are from the state where the institution is located, then the department would use the lowest of the median earnings of working adults located in the state where the institution is located in the state in which the institution is located, and in the same field of study under either the 2-digit SIP or 4-digit SIP code. That's how they're sort of defining this same field, right? To the extent data is available. And the department has told us as of right now, they don't have the 4-digit, it's not available. But if it becomes available, they'll use it because they think it's a better proxy for field of study. Or nationally, and in the same field of study under the 2-digit or 4-digit zip code. So it's the lowest of these. And just as a reminder, this is the benchmark against which you're being compared. So the lower the benchmark, the better for the institution, insofar as you're trying to preserve your program's eligibility for direct loans, right? So just to be clear, the department under the rules is giving you the benefit of the lower of these three. Now, if you have a graduate degree program, and if fewer than 50% of the students enrolled in the institution during the award year for which calculations are made are from the state where the institution is located, Ed would use the lowest of the median earnings of working adults nationally or nationally in the same field of study, using that 2-digit or 4-digit zip code concept core field of study, right? So for graduate degrees, the benchmark test, finding the exact number is a little more nuanced. Earnings data for working adults, again, this is coming from the Census Bureau, and specifically it's coming from the Census Bureau's American Community Survey, which it already creates. So just to be clear, the department is not going to go out and do a new survey, right? The idea is they're finding a data point that already exists and utilizing that, which is why they have some restrictions around what they can do here. The ACS, if you're not familiar with it, is updated annually and collects detailed social, economic, housing, and demographic data for a sample of households across the 50 states, the District of Columbia, and Puerto Rico. And that's why I said I think Puerto Rico, the census data will have that information. They'll be able to do the earnings premium for schools in Puerto Rico, but it doesn't say anything about the freely associated states or other territories. And so that makes me feel like maybe it won't be available for those. The definition of earnings. So the community survey actually has the ability to cut earnings in a couple of different ways. It provides two primary options for the consideration of earnings. One is personal income from wages and salary. The other is personal income from wages, salary, and income through self-employment. The department, in putting together the PPD 26, its big data set, used the second version, which means that they also used that version when they were determining earnings for your completers. Because remember, they want to have apples to apples here. So they decided for the benchmark to use number 2, and then they used the same concept and methodology when they were using defining earnings for your working completers. Same thing with working. So the ACS actually can cut working in 4 different ways, and the department decided to use individuals who are in the labor force employed and have a positive non-zero income. So you have to report at least $1 of income or you're out of the cohort. And that is the same thing they did when trying to determine who was working for purposes of your completer cohort. Here are the magic numbers. So what you see here is the department gave you a grid, and they said, these are the different median income numbers, these are the benchmarks based on how we slice that data. If we use different definitions of earnings, or if we do use different definitions of working. The one that they used in the PPD 26, and we expect that they will use it on a go-forward basis, that's, again, employed with positive income, not employed full-time, just employed with positive income. And then for earnings, we're talking about wages, salary, and business income. And what you see here is for undergraduate certificates, non-degree programs, and undergraduate degree programs, it's the chart on the left. So the magic number that was used, that earnings threshold you had to beat, was 34,808. On the right, we see for graduate programs, they were being compared to this group, and you can see that the number the department used was 60,112. A couple of observations here. I mean, the first is, keep in mind, because a lot of people may say, well, wait a minute, working should include full-time, because our program has a lot of people who work part-time. Hear you loud and clear, but just keep in mind, if the department uses a definition of working that is only full-time for your completers, then they are going to also only pull earnings for full-time employed people for the benchmark. And the result is that the benchmark goes up. And you can see that in this chart, right? So they used employed with positive income, but that could be full-time or part-time employment. It's 34,808. But if the department had decided to use full-time, then the number goes up to 36,497. So the median rises, right? So you just have to remember, it could be for certain programs, like if 90% of your students are part-time, your earnings may be lower because so few people are full-time as opposed to the general population where a higher percentage are full-time. I get that. But I just wanted to highlight that as these definitions change, it affects both numbers, both your completers median earnings and also the benchmark median earnings. The other thing you may have keyed into here, and we said this at the table, I said it several times, is, there's a different test for graduate programs and for undergraduate degree programs, but it's the same test for undergraduate degree programs and non-degree programs, which means that Stanford's bachelor's degree in economics has the same standard as Miss Betty's Beauty Academy, right? So the Stanford graduate has to make more than 34,808, or at least the median of that cohort. But similarly, the cohort of graduates from Miss Betty's Beauty Academy also have to make 34,808. Many people may want to say, the fact that 92% of cosmetology programs in the United States, and I made this point at the table, are failing, or at least 92% of students are in programs that are failing. And when you sort of say out loud this idea of like, well, why would a bachelor's degree in, economics from Stanford, why would you expect them to meet the same threshold as cosmetology students? in a 6-month or 7-month 900-hour cosmetology program. When you say that out loud, I don't think it makes a lot of sense. And the benchmarks and the methodologies and requirements as applied to non-degree programs, keep in mind, that is all regulatory. So that potentially could be subject to change between the proposed rule and the final rule. That is not baked into the statute, right? Just something to consider as you're formulating your public comments. Let's talk about the consequences of failure. Each year, and I've talked about this a little bit, but just to click back through them, upon finalizing the earnings premium, the department would issue a notice of determination to the institution. Consequences are student warnings if you fail once, loss of direct loan eligibility if your program fails twice. And then we talked about this administrative capability concept. If more than 50% of your programs, more than 50% of your Title IV recipients are in, or your Title IV revenue is coming from low earning outcome programs, you could run into an administrative capability issue, and the consequence should be that your failing programs lose Pell Grant eligibility as well. Student warnings, I talked about. This gives you a little more detail. The department did make an effort to streamline the student warning requirements because they're already in the existing financial value transparency and gainful employment rule. Also, the department would preserve the requirement that an institution may not sign an enrollment agreement, complete registration, enter a financial commitment, or disperse Title IV funds to a prospective student earlier than 3 business days after the institution delivers the warning and until the prospective student completes an acknowledgement. So if you've got failing programs, even after 1 year, you're going to have to do the warnings, and you're going to have to talk with your VPs of enrollment and others in the missions about how to integrate these requirements. And this is for all programs, not just non-degree programs. So every bachelor's degree, every master's degree, every doctoral program in the United States. I'm just going quickly through these because, the warnings and the requirements are really important, but, I want to get to questions. Loss of direct loan eligibility, really important. So a Title IV program would become ineligible for direct loans if the program, I think that says of, but it should say if the program failed the earnings premium test in 2 out of any 3 consecutive award years for which the earnings premium is calculated. So if you have a year where the earnings premium isn't calculated because you have such a small cohort, it's just sort of like it becomes invisible. It's like a skipped year. It's a no result. A program's participation in a direct loan program would end upon the completion of a termination action under Subpart G. So what's interesting is your participation doesn't end automatically July 1st when you get that second determination. The regulation does suggest that there has to be some sort of process by which the second determination goes to an administrative hearing official or official, and then you have the official termination action. And part of that, I suspect what will happen is when you get a determination notice, it will tell you about your opportunity to appeal. And so if institutions appeal, either way, the final determination of the loss of eligibility or the appeal all happens through a Subpart G process. And Subpart G is already in the regulations and governs, I think it's final limitation termination proceedings for institutions. There's also this voluntary program closure. This did not exist in the initial regulatory proposal we saw on Monday. Credit to Justin Monk at NICU. He and I were at lunch, and we were talking about trying to come up with some way within the regulatory framework that institutions, if they have a failing program, particularly bachelor's degree and longer programs, could still fund students in that program if they were committed to teaching it out, right? Because as it stands, if you fail twice, you lose direct loan eligibility. And the problem is some of you may have programs that are 3 or 4 years long. So the department agreed to this idea. The negotiators agreed to it as well. Following its first failure, and provided the department agrees, an institution would have 120 days. So you get that first failure notice. You've got 120 days to sign a PPA amendment permitting you to voluntarily teach out the program. Among other requirements, you'd have to immediately stop ceasing new enrollments, and this decision is not reversible. So if you commit to teaching out the program and the next year the department calculates your rates and you pass, too bad. You've committed to teaching out the program. You can't reverse the decision, right? But the upside, and by the way, you don't have to take this. It's an option. No one is compelled to do this. But the idea is if you decide to do this, it would permit continued access to direct loans for the lesser of 3 years or the full-time normal duration of the program. So it would give most institutions an opportunity to continue dispersing direct loans to existing students until hopefully all or most of them can graduate, right? Following the end of the teach out, the program would be subject to period of ineligibility requirements, which brings me to my next slide. So an institution may not seek to reestablish the direct loan eligibility of a failing program that it discontinued voluntarily, either before or after the earnings premium measure becomes effective for that program, or reestablish the direct loan eligibility of a program that is ineligible because it's failed twice until 2 years following the earlier of the date the program loses eligibility or the date the institution voluntarily discontinued the failing program. Now, in the case of a program where you determined to teach it out, no, I think it's still consistent. It's still the earlier of the date the program loses eligibility or the date the institution you voluntarily discontinued the failing program. So this is important. And it's another consideration. It's not a sanction in and of itself, but it certainly modifies the stakes. It's not like if a program loses eligibility, you can just turn around and relaunch it, right? Further, during that 2-year period of ineligibility, you may not seek to establish direct loan eligibility for a new program that would be sharing the same 4-digit zip code and has any overlapping SOC codes. Now, in the existing law, it's just the same 4-digit zip code. But what we worked with the negotiators in the department to do was to try to make that a slightly smaller box. So if you have another program that's within the same 4-digit zip code as one that's already failed, but you can demonstrate when you do the SIP to SOC crosswalk that this thing trains people for completely different occupations, there's no overlap, then you could launch that other new program. The other thing, though, that's so critical is, and this really highlights, is the importance between now and when you get your first round of failing rates in early 27 of rolling out replacement programs, because today you're not subject to any limitations. But once you start having programs fail, you start to become potentially subject to limitations, even if you voluntarily discontinue your program or choose the teach out option. So it's critically important if you've got programs that are failing right now to consider whether you could roll out a replacement program that, while you're not subject to any limitations, that would be a new program without any earnings history and might be attractive to some of the students or the kinds of students who are in the program that is likely to lose eligibility. There's a very limited appeal option here. There was a lot of vigorous debate over this. I personally think that Congress and the statute intended for the department to offer a more robust appeal opportunity to institutions. At the end of the day, and many recommendations were made to the department for appeal options, including by me and others. The department declined. And I think the primary reason is because I think the department is just very committed to having something it can actually operationalize and implement. And it is true that when you have lots of appeal options, or even just 1 or 2 appeal options, it becomes more complicated and delays things. That being said, Congress mandated an appeal right. And we think there are meaningful appeal options that could be operationalized without slowing down the department too much. And some of those suggestions were made. This is another area where I think there is tremendous opportunity for public comment. And I would really encourage folks to be thoughtful about that. And you say, well, Aaron, what kind of appeals do you mean? Well, think about it. I mean, you could say, for example, if I have failed at the state level, but I'm a small school in West Texas, can you recalculate the earnings benchmark, that's the Census Bureau data, based on either a set of zip codes or micropolitan data or something like that. So I'm getting an earnings threshold that may be more specific to where I am, because in large states like Texas, where there's significant dynamics between what you see as the median earnings in major metro markets like Dallas or Houston and small markets like Corpus Christi or out in West Texas somewhere, that it could make a real difference as to whether those programs should pass or not. And we called it a local earnings appeal, right? You could have an equal earnings appeal. Can you demonstrate that 95% of your students are women or minorities, and argue that they're subject to wage discrimination? There are a lot of concepts, and the most classic concept would just be a straight up alternate earnings appeal, which existed under the Obama administration's version of the gainful employment rule. Now, the department has flatly said we're not going to entertain some sort of alternate earnings appeal where you go out and get survey data and say, I surveyed my students and this is what they gave us. And I understand that, and there's some pretty strong arguments. But more and more states are now producing state-based earning systems with reliable data. And one easy thing that the department could do is it could allow someone to say, give me 60 days to go to the state system and pull the earnings data from the state system for the same people on that completers list to see if it's more representative, right? So I think there are appeal opportunities here. I really encourage folks to think about that. Finally, GE program certifications. This is just basically sticking around. It's been here as a condition of continued participation in the Title IV programs. An institution would now be required for all Title IV programs to certify that it agrees to comply with the requirements of Subpart Q and S, and that every Title IV program is accredited, et cetera. And the other thing is this requirement also for all programs now, and this is, I spoke to this earlier, this is another place where this is sort of worked in. I think it's belt and suspenders, but here the department says to establish the eligibility of a program for direct loans, a new program, you have to update your institution's direct loan eligible programs maintained on the e-card. So, and if you make changes, you have to update within 10 days, right? You don't have to wait for the department's approval unless you are an institution that doesn't qualify to self-certify. So for a lot of institutions, this is just a notification obligation. It's still a hassle, but you don't have to wait for feedback. But if you're on provisional certification or one of certain other statuses, you might actually have to wait for approval back from the department before you can start funding that program. And keep that in mind, because again, in traditional higher ed, you've not historically, for degree programs and graduate degree programs, had to report those to the department and put them on your e-app. All right, 3:40. We have 20 minutes. The last thing I'm going to hit on is institutional action plans, and then let's go to Q&A. Some of this I've already said, but it's worth repeating. Strongly encourage everyone, again, because the committee reached consensus, you as a community have the benefit of knowing that what I'm talking about today and what you're seeing in this draft text on the department's website is very similar, if not almost identical to what the proposed rule is going to say, because that's the deal. That's what the department agreed to do. So you can start preparing your public comments now. You don't have to wait until the proposed rule comes out. Read it when it comes out, make any needed modifications, but you can go ahead and start thinking about your strategy. I would also, I think this thing's going to happen. And so initiating conversations with institutional leadership, legal counsel, academics, and others to begin developing a compliance plan, both reporting requirements, also talk with your VEEPs of enrollment, make sure they understand that these warning requirements, things like that should be coming. Determine which programs, if any, may fail. I mean, goodness sakes, the department has created a data set for every institution, every program. It's the 4-digit SIP level, but that's still pretty directional and informative. Every institution in the United States should be pulling that data set and looking to see what it says about the programs. And in particular, if you've got a program that is way below the threshold or is one of these that we know is going to be disproportionately impacted, you should be on top of that now, because you have a limited period of time during which you could roll out replacement programs without any restrictions or limitations, right? And then you also may just, for other reasons, want to start preparing and considering, are we going to teach this out? Do we think we can run it for 2 years? Do we think, there's not a lot you can do to improve the earnings, but there may be other things that you think you can do. Integrated earnings analysis into program development, especially as this thing moves forward over the years and you start getting median earnings data back for your programs. Some may be passing, but may be very close. I mean, I would definitely be thoughtful about which of your programs, both existing and as you develop them, are likely to do well or likely to have problems. And then finally, again, just please consider commenting on the proposed rule. Your perspective is valuable. Please don't assume that the department sees everything that you see. This is our 4th secret word, and then we'll go, I'm going to tell you again about our amazing Regucation website where you can find all our great stuff, and I'll put that QR code up and we'll start answering questions with a solid, it's like a record for Aaron Lacey, like a solid 20 minutes left. The 4th secret word is Bronco. Please select it from the options down below. It is option C. So please, if you're a legal aid attorney type and you want that continuing legal education, go ahead and select it. And then again, we'll get into questions very shortly here. I'm going to take another toke on my tea. Non-caffeinated, no less. So it's pretty weak stuff. All right, I think we're pretty close. Just another beat here while folks get a chance. You know what, actually, I'll just leave it up. I can show you the QR code in a minute. Let's go ahead and just get into questions. And I'm going to scroll back to the beginning. Okay, let's see. What can institutions do now in preparation? Some of that we've talked about. From your perspective, are the DE rates and earnings premium tests skewed by individuals that are self-employed? Well, the DE rates are off. the table with this proposal, but certainly any earnings test has the potential to be skewed if you have a lot of graduates who are self-employed. I mean, by using IRS data, I'm not a tax attorney. I'm not as in tune as CPAs and some others are, but it's my understanding that as opposed to Social Security Administration data, one of the benefits of using IRS data is it does a better job of capturing some of that self-employment income. But the bottom line is some people, when they're starting small businesses, are investing a disproportionate amount back into the business and paying themselves very little in order to make the business grow and be successful. And I think that would hurt the outcomes for your program, right? Because that's not going to be viewed, I don't think, necessarily as earnings. Again, I mean, this is really a good question, I think, at some level for the tax attorneys and CPAs of the world, but I believe that is correct. I think the bigger problem in my mind, I mean, self-employment income is a problem potentially if folks are underpaying themselves or not paying them at all, I think, but tip income, I think, is a huge problem. And then gig work. And that's, a lot of these like performing arts folks are not earning very much. They're waiting tables. They're trying to get their band started or get that acting job, et cetera. Or they're taking small amounts, they're gigging in and around and they don't have a steady income. And I think for sure it impacts those types of income are problematic. Okay, let's see. Is the earnings premium test the same calculation? I think we went through all that in a pretty high level of detail. Let's see. During the negotiations last week, there was a data request for graduate earnings data at the 6-digit SIP level for institutions and programs. The department seemed to indicate that request was in progress and being validated. Will these data be published? I don't recall if there were a number of data requests that were filled in the last day, but if they are published, the data requests that were made available, I don't know if the department, it's not my understanding that they're planning to fill any additional data requests following the end of NEGREG. But there were a number of data requests fulfilled on the last day on Friday. And if you go to the NEGREG website, towards the bottom, it says day 5, and those data requests are there. So you may be able to find it. What does ECAR stand for? Eligibility, Certification, and Approval Report. So your financial aid staff would know. When you report things to the U.S. Department of Education, most things you report them through your electronic application. That's the department's portal. It's now under Partner Connect. And there is an option for you to print essentially what is a snapshot, think like a regulatory balance sheet that shows all the information that's in the department systems and all the approvals. And that is the eligibility, certification, and approval report. And it lists all the programs and those kinds of things. So when I say ECAR, that's what I mean. Great question. Let's see. Can you clarify? Oh, wait, sorry. I was wondering if you could share more about the expansion of GE certification requirements under 668-604 to eligible non-GE programs and that 10-day update new program window. Many institutions are going to be unfamiliar with this process if they haven't had GE programs, and the cross-references don't appear to have been updated, still speak mostly GE-specific factors. I think the intent was just to have institutions update a list of direct loan programs, but I'm a little concerned that unrelated GE certification requirements will also attach. What do you think? Well, I think the intent is on a go-forward basis that institutions have to report every program that they want to be eligible for direct loans, whether it's a GE or non-GE program. And what's interesting is I have no doubt that that's the department's intent. I think they feel like that's necessary and they need that in part so that they could administer the accountability framework. But even beyond that, I think they just like the idea of having the data. I do think it'll be challenging and cumbersome. I won't say most, but many institutions, including in traditional higher ed, do have some non-degree programs, post-baccalaureate certificates, shorter term certificates, graduate certificates. So a lot of them do these days have a few programs, and your financial aid staff will certainly know how to access your EAP and add programs, among the many other things that they're required to add. But I don't disagree that this is a new and not insignificant burden on institutions. And I think it was the first comment I made in NEGREG, because that was the first thing we got to. And I was trying to understand, I wanted to confirm with the department, when this was really just a notification requirement and when it would be an approval requirement. Because my concern is you've got a federal agency that's under a standing order to diminish itself to the maximum extent under the law, and you're creating a new reporting requirement that is not insignificant. And you could have many institutions, particularly at a time when higher ed is contracting and folks are trying to innovate, who may be trying to provide new programs so that they can expand, and they can't get it done because they're waiting on approvals from the department. Moreover, many of the institutions that most need those approvals and most need to innovate are the ones who are currently financially strapped and may be subject to financial, some sort of financial responsibility, provisional certification, or something else that requires them to wait for approval, and meaning that they're not able to just self-certify. So absolutely understand the concern here. I don't think the department's going to back off of it much, although you can certainly comment on that. I think they're going to say we really have to have this information. They probably would also say if Miss Betty's Beauty Academy can do it, Ohio State can figure out how to do it as well. I wouldn't be surprised with that kind of response. Can you clarify for testing under these regs, will it be by program at 6-digit zip code? Yes. So this won't be aggregated by credential level. Each program will be evaluated individually. Yes, except if they go back when they're aggregating the cohort again, they can't get at least 30 completers. When they go back, I think it's 5 years total, right? Because the fourth year, prior year is the single year they start with, and then they go back 4 more years, which would be 5 total. That's just within your program. They can't get to 30 completers. At that point, they will start expanding and looking at other programs you offer that are within the same 2-digit or 4-digit SIP and aggregate the cohort. And then they'll do the same thing for 2. This is an important point. The test and whether it passes or fails is still just for that original program, right? So I've got a 6-digit zip code and a credential level, So let's just say I've got a bachelor's degree in religious studies. If the department has to go back and start aggregating and bringing in more people to get to 30, they can do that. But the test is still only being applied to that one program. It doesn't somehow, and then if that program fails, that doesn't somehow bleed into and create a failure for those other programs that were pulled in for purposes of the aggregation. So, and then what that means is, it's a little confusing, but what it means is, they're going to go through each individual program. So I could have program A, and I may be pulling in data from other programs for the purposes of testing program A. Then I might test program B, which had its data pulled into that program A test. Program B on its own may pass. The other thing I would offer is, after a couple of years, a lot of your programs that have low earnings are probably going to be gone. So if the department is trying to test program A 3 years from now and is expanding the cohort, it seems likely to me that a lot of those other programs that are getting pulled in, the earnings that are getting pulled in for that program A, may be higher earnings and actually boost program A. So if you've got a program that's close to the line, but it's really small, it may always be pulling in earnings from other programs in that 4-digit SIP, and they may have higher median earnings, and it may actually allow you to keep offering that smaller program that has lower earnings because it's always being boosted by related programs with higher earnings. So it may not cut against you. Okay. By the way, I'm going to take a quick break. Here's the magic QR code. This is our platform where all of our stuff that's free is housed, and we welcome you to check it out at your discretion. Okay. Let's see. Will a nonprofit master or doctoral degree program lose Title IV funding if they do not meet the required minimum standards? Yes. Yes. Every Title IV program is subject to these standards, and the earnings premium for undergraduate degree programs, graduate degree programs, and graduate certificates is in the statute. It's in the statute. It's not optional for the department. It's just really important. Sorry to keep hammering that, but I just want to make sure folks, it's really clear. Okay. Were changes to the GE clock hour 150% rule versus the new 100% rule discussed or included? No, that was not part of this negotiated rulemaking. Great question. There is another rulemaking coming up about accreditation that I think is going to be very contentious. And then there's another rulemaking the department is planning for later this spring that colloquially is being referred to as sort of the kitchen sink or Christmas tree rulemaking. And I think there will be a lot of different topics put into that bucket. Change in ownership will be one of them. I think the 150% rule may show up there as well. Let's see. Earlier you talked about having to add all programs on the PPA e-cart. Is this pretty well set or just a proposal? It's in the regulations. This is something you could comment on publicly. And I think the department's view is it's got to do this in part to carry out the statutory pieces of the Do No Harm framework, but I think that's up for debate. Again, keep in mind, I think it's new programs. So I think it's a going forward thing. I don't read the regulatory proposal as requiring you to go back and add all existing direct loan programs. I think I read the regulatory proposal as if you want to add new direct loan programs, you have to add those programs. And then if you modify programs, you have to update the department around that modification. Let's see. Whew. This is a long one. Okay. Based on the disproportionate impact on undergraduate certificates, the proposed regulations seem to discourage practices like stackable certificates that can lead to a higher degree. Are stackable certificates held to the same standards as standalone certificates? It seems like they should be. Yeah, I mean, what'll happen is, so those are different programs, right? So let's say I got a certificate program that leads into an associate degree program. The student will be in the completers cohort for the certificate program unless they subsequently move into and complete the associate degree program, at which point they will be excluded from the certificate program and put into the associate degree program. Both your certificate program and your associate degree program will be measured, and they will be measured independent of one another. The only question is, where does that completer go? But if you go to the slide on exclusions from the cohort, one of the exclusions, that's what that relates to, is stackable or further education. So the idea is if a student, again, moves out of your first program and into your second program and then completes it, then they get moved out of the lower level program and only are measured in the upper program. Now, keep in mind, there's a hard line between undergraduate and graduate. So if someone completes a bachelor's degree program and stays for a master's, they stay included in both cohorts. But if they're in a master's program and go on to get their PhD, and then they graduate from the PhD program, they get pulled out of the master's cohort and put into the PhD, assuming they've graduated from the PhD program prior to the point at which their earnings would be measured for purposes of the master's degree program. It's a little complicated, but the point is, all those programs still get measured. They're stackable, but they're still independent programs from one another, and they're going to be measured independent of one another. When you get into like dual credit programs, dual degree, stuff like that gets a little more complicated, and the department has acknowledged that that's the kind of thing they just typically have to work through in sub-regulatory guidance. Okay. Is there school level data available with the PPD 26? Yes, and I showed you that slide that had all the links and arrows and everything, and 100% you should be looking at that data set. What about doctoral problem highlights? Yeah, the department, I think I mentioned that earlier about just, again, the department didn't include a slide on doctoral problem highlights. We didn't have a lot of discussion around it. They didn't have data specifically for qualifying graduate programs. But my understanding at the doctoral level is they did not anticipate significant doctoral level problems, although I think that there may be some programs out there at the doctoral level that will have problems. I think we as a community are just going to have to do that analysis independently. But it's in the data set. It is in the data set. The department just didn't create a nifty graphic for it. A substantial number of programs in the PPD lack earnings data. Yes. Any expectation that more complete earnings data will become available, and if so, when? What's interesting is the department, somewhere in all their slide decks, the department had a slide, and it showed that something like, I'm ballparking here, but it was something like 42% of all programs have cohorts that are so small that they're not going to end up getting measured even after all the aggregation. So you've got a huge percentage of programs that are not actually going to be measured under the metric. But that 42% of Title IV programs educates like 6% of Title IV students, right? So the measurement will cover the vast majority of Title IV students, but it doesn't cover the vast majority of Title IV programs because you have this really significant percentage of programs that are out there that have lots of really small cohorts. which also raises the question that I will just throw out there for you all to consider is, are those profitable? I mean, it's really interesting to me that institutions, 42% of Title IV programs that are being offered by Title IV institutions are only educating 6% of Title IV students or something like that. And it sort of makes me wonder what the cost associated with those 42% of programs. I assume if you're on this phone or this line and you are teaching one of those programs, you may disagree strongly with Aaron. As a guy who is constantly getting calls from institutions that are worried about their long-term viability, it does make me wonder, that institutions seem to be supporting such a high percentage of programs with such a small percentage of students in them. But I'm speculating. I don't pretend to be a master of operations, and I will leave that to you all to be thoughtful about. But it was a pretty interesting statistic. Let's see. When the earnings-based accountability metric produces failure rates of 98% of master's degrees, like in alternative and complementary medicine, how should a do no harm framework guide whether the issue is program quality versus metric design? Well, it's not program quality. To be super clear, an earnings test does not measure program quality, right? It just doesn't. It doesn't measure the quality of the instructors or the curriculum or the enthusiasm or quality of the graduates. It doesn't measure, again, value-added earnings. Are they making more after they graduate than they were before? It doesn't measure social value, meaning the value of the program to society. It doesn't measure lifetime financial value, right? Or lifetime financial earnings. All it measures is how much people are making 4 years after they graduate. The problem is Congress has been hearing from the public about the cost of higher education for 20 years. And they feel like they need to do something. And they decided to do that something in a truncated process inside of reconciliation. So, the do no harm framework was not thought up in the context of higher education reauthorization. That hasn't happened in 17 years. But when it used to happen, you had 18 months to 2 years of very deliberate and thoughtful discussion and negotiation among the parties. And then you'd have this deliberate and thoughtful reauthorization of the Higher Education Act. And most of what was in there made a little more sense. This thing was conceived rapidly and not as part of that process in response to those concerns. Congress and people at the department, both Democrats and Republicans, they want to eliminate some programs. They want to show that they're responding, and this is what they came up with. But if your question to me is, does the do no harm framework adequately measure program quality? The answer is 100% resoundingly no. And that is not what it measures. Again, it's like measuring the quality of your dinner based on calories. It's just not what it measures, right? So, and don't let anybody tell you otherwise. There were negotiators at the table who would occasionally continue to refer to these as low value programs. And we kept trying to call them out on that and say, look, I understand that they are not passing the test, but they're not low value programs by any metric other than how much graduates are making 4 years after they graduate. That is the only measurement in play here. And I think it's just, I'm agreeing with you. I mean, I think the between the lines implication here of the question is, does this thing really make sense? I think there are better ways to evaluate the quality of programming and its value. But this is the test we've got in statute. And the only real way we're going to change this is we got to elect different people or better educate the people who are there. That's the problem. And that's on all of us that are part of the higher education community. Are you aware of any plans for the department to release another PPD with programs with the 6-digit zip code and or aggregated data? I think I don't know. I think it's possible they could try to do something either with the proposed rule or final rule, but keep in mind, they want your data this fall and they want to be issuing rates in 2027. So I think they're pretty committed. I think the department does have an incentive and recognizes that incentive to try to get institutions information as early as possible that they can utilize. So I don't know. I don't think they committed to that. I don't know if they would want to try to do a dry run at the 6-digit level between now and next spring, but they might. And I think that's something else folks in public comment could really push for and say, look, it's useful, but I've got 7 programs at my institution that are all within the same 4-digit zip code, and I can't do adequate planning without a 6-digit run. Let's see here. I may have misunderstood a report out last week, but in terms of alt and comp medicine programs, I understood there was a conversation around removal of zip code 5133. Can you please clarify I don't know anything about that. I do know that zip codes get reorganized periodically. I don't know if we're talking about just a general reorganization of zip codes, but if you mean like as an exclusion from this test, certainly that was nothing along those lines was even discussed during the week. And there's no basis for that in statute. I think it would be very hard for the department to cherry pick out certain programs. I mean, and we kept talking all week about not only that, but, cosmetology, massage therapy. Here's the thing, again, you got to understand is that the department and the folks on the Hill want some carnage. They want to show that they are doing something and addressing concerns. So they are resistant to exclusions and carve-outs and approaches that would either lower the threshold or otherwise save a bunch of programs, because they don't ultimately want to save a bunch of programs. They want to show that they are holding higher education accountable. Please understand, I'm not saying that that's necessarily a good thing or that makes policy sense. I just want folks to understand the political dynamics that are in play here. So, don't expect, make the public comment, argue for it passionately, but I just want you to say, I don't think people should expect some sort of SIP digit based carve out. And of course, the problem is if you start carving out one industry, why not this one and why not that one? And I think the department's worried about the slippery slope problem as well. For schools that already reported financial value transparency GE data for 24-25, will they have to resubmit that data? That is a great question. I don't know the answer to. I don't know if the department will feel like it needs, because the data sets are pretty similar. So I just don't know if they feel like they'll be able to rely on that data with maybe just some supplemental reporting. We did not get into that kind of operational question, but it is a great question. What about programs that were created in the last 3 years? Newly created programs. I think the department's going to measure everything that's out there, but if you did not have a cohort prior to 2021 or 22-23, I don't know how they could run the test on the program. They're always going to be, also you may have smaller numbers in that cohort. So I think when you're rolling out programs or you're sunsetting programs, it may impact or will impact whether you even get tested at all, and or whether you can be tested. Because remember, if you don't have earnings for at least 15 people, the department doesn't run the test. Or I can't remember if it's more than 15. It may be for more than 15. Then the department doesn't run the test. Well, what that means is if you've just started your program and there have never been any graduates, you can't have completers who have earnings. So absolutely, it's one of the reasons it's so important to be thinking about replacement programs right now, because you could roll out a replacement program now and it may be years before it even gets tested, right? Because you're going to have to get people through the program. They're going to have to graduate, and 4 years are going to have to go by before the department can even test those programs. So replacement programs are a critically important concept. I understand in certain industries, I was on the phone earlier today with someone, like, they have a program that leads people into a licensed profession, and the state professional licensure requirements require a certain degree. So you can't just roll out a different degree. Although, if you're in one of these industries that's dramatically impacted, maybe it's time to go to the state and say, right now you will only accept this degree. Would you accept a different degree as a basis for people to become licensed? That's a pretty radical concept, but I'm just trying to think about all the options that might be on the table. Okay, somebody here's, well, one person's asking me about the specific meaning of the columns in the spreadsheet. If you go back to that page where that spreadsheet's located, there's a thing called the code book, and it tells you what each one of those mean. Is the website we need to link to currently up and running? Yeah, if you mean the negotiated rulemaking 25-26, yeah, the spreadsheet's out there. Also, it's in our resources widget. But if you want the code book and all the accompanying spreadsheets that went along with that one, you'd have to go to the department's website, but it's there. Everything's up. Under current distribution requirements, is the department's program information website currently available? No. And is there a link we should be providing now? No. So I think it's going to be a while before the department's program information website is up and running. I don't mean years, but I mean, could be a year, right? If they go back to the 4 and 2 SIP, are some programs then counted twice, both in the 6 SIP? Yes. So you could have earnings. This goes back to the thing I was talking about earlier. Yes, you could have earnings that show up in the cohort, people and earnings who show up in more than one cohort, because you've had 2 or 3 different programs that have had to be aggregated and earnings and completers pulled in to get them up to 30. So 100% you could have overlap. You could have a single earner who shows up theoretically in three different cohorts, right? But each program is tested individually, right? I hope that makes sense. I feel like I need to come up with some sort of visual for that. I believe I heard you say that in year 1, we're submitting student data for the last 2 academic years, award years. If a program fails in both of those years, that would represent 2 out of 3 years of failure, correct? Thank you. The department is not, they're testing 1 year at a time. Great question. So you're giving 2 award years worth of data. Keep in mind the department may have to aggregate and go back in time. And so, it's trying to get, and also for purposes of the program information website, it wants debt and earnings, all those kinds of things. But for purposes of the earnings premium, they're just doing 1 calculation per cycle. And that's a really great question, an important point. How I'm not fully understand. Okay, let's get that one. For the graduate program earnings test, did the department propose any language that differentiates graduate programs and professional degree programs? No. And the statute does not draw that distinction. So I know this is relevant for professional or for loan limits, which was part of the RISE committee consideration. For purposes of accountability, there's no distinction drawn between the earnings premium test and how it works for graduate or professional degree programs. Everything that is at the graduate level in a graduate degree program gets tested the same way, and then undergraduate certificates get tested in a certain way as well. Okay. Great question. Let's see. Did the department discuss whether it would calculate earnings premium even for programs that don't participate in the direct loan program, like a Pell-only school? Does the department have the authority under the One Big Beautiful Bill Act to impose overall Title IV eligibility if the school's programs turn out to be low earnings outcome programs when the school isn't participating in direct loans? That is a great question. And it did come up because one of our negotiators was the executive director for an accreditor that oversees religious institutions and accredits religious institutions. And he noted that many Talmudic schools don't do direct loans. And even proposed this idea that they be exempted, because he said the problem is they do no direct loans. They're being tested every year, but their earnings are low. They could fail. And if more than 50% of their programs or, the recipients in Title IV volume is failing, they could ultimately lose Pell Grant eligibility too, notwithstanding the fact that they're not doing direct loans. That is currently how it would work. I think this is another superb place for folks to comment. In public comment. I don't know how many of those schools that are out there, but yes, I think Pell eligible schools should consider commenting on this point, and I appreciate you asking the question. How will our reporting requirements differ from our current financial value transfer? I think we went through that in pretty good detail on some of the slides. Let's see. When it comes to starting new programs, are these prohibitions blanket prohibitions? Institutions could not start any program in the same SIP, even if it is not seeking Title IV eligibility. Or is it only a prohibition on seeking new Title? It's just new Title IV eligible, right? So it's it's seeking eligibility for a new direct loan eligible program. That's an interesting question as to whether you would be barred from rolling out a new. I'm not sure, because the prohibition is in the certifications, and the certification relates to direct loan eligibility. This is an interesting question. I'm not 100% sure, but I think it's something that should be run to ground. But I think the idea is if you have a failing program, you lose direct loan eligibility, but you've not passed that administrative capability standpoint. So you haven't lost any Pell for anybody. I don't think it would stop you from rolling out substantially similar programs for which you're not seeking direct loan eligibility. I think that's right. To be confirmed. By the way, did I mention that this is not legal advice? Let me, there we go. There's the conditions of use and disclaimer. This is for informational purposes only. If the department uses prior year earnings to calculate median earnings for school students, will they take into account the census data for those same earlier years? Well, the census data point is fixed. So the department is looking at earnings, like, for example, in 2025, under the Census Bureau's data point, for any individual between the ages of 25 and 34. So you could have someone who's graduated with a bachelor's degree in engineering and been an engineer for 17 years, and they are being compared to your master's degree student who's been out of school for 4 years. So the difference is your completers are always being measured 4 years after they graduate. But for the benchmark, they're taking 2025 earnings for everyone between the ages of 25 and 34. So again, if you had someone who graduated with their bachelor's degree when they were 24 years old or 25, they could have been in the workforce now, maybe not 17. I guess you wouldn't graduate. Let me read it. You wouldn't graduate typically with that bachelor's degree until you're at least 24, 25. But you could have been in the workforce for 9 years with a bachelor's degree in accounting or engineering or whatever. We made that point abundantly clear, but that is in the statute. That's just not something for non-degree programs. It's regulatory, and you could try to comment, and I encourage folks to be thoughtful about this, whether they think non-degree programs should have a slightly different standard. Like we said, we think the standard should be, for example, for folks who are between the ages of 20 and 24, right? And not 20, 25, and 34. But for bachelor's degree programs and, for undergraduate degree programs and graduate degree programs, the benchmarks are in the statute, and the department does not have the ability to change those meanings. All right, I'm going to do one more, and then I'm going to pass out because I've been 2 hours and a quarter. In theory, could an institution voluntarily discontinue a bachelor's degree program, take 3 years to fully teach it out, 1 year longer than the 2-year period to reestablish loan eligibility, and seek to reestablish that 4-digit SIP program before the teach out is completed? No, because the period of ineligibility starts at the end of the teach out. So let's be real clear about this. You've got a bachelor's degree program. You voluntarily do the teach out. It takes 3 years to do the teach out. Then you have 2 years of loan ineligibility, 5 years from the moment you decide to start that. That was clearly what the department was contemplating, what we understood to be the scenario. Not that that 2-year period would start before you had even started teaching out the program, or at the same time you teach out the program. So to be clear, the department's view is the 2-year period of ineligibility. This is also true if you voluntarily discontinue your program. It begins when the program is voluntarily taught out, not at the point the decision is made. Really important point. All right, one more. I can't help myself. Let's see. How does this affect state approving agencies for military connected students, or does it not? None of this applies any differently to military connected students. The gentleman, Matt, who was great, who was the primary and also his alternate, but when he was talking about veteran students, he was very concerned about people relocating and moving around. And that there's some disclosure things we put in there. It was one of the reasons we were really interested in the teach out concept, so that someone would have an opportunity if they were moving around, that kind of thing. But there is the question, it's an interesting question about if a school has a high percentage of veterans. The only place where I really see that coming into play and being challenging is when you're talking about if you have 50% of your students in state or out of state. I think institutions that educate a high percentage of veteran students on their FAFSA, et cetera, probably may be indicating that they are located or are in other states or from other states, right? And that could impact the 50% question as to which benchmark you get. But really, there's nothing about the framework that applies differently that I can recall, and apologies if I'm forgetting this to Matt and others, but I don't think there's anything that really applies differently. I mean, the idea was to be thoughtful when crafting this framework so that we did not create anything that would disproportionately impact veteran students. And in some places, there was a real effort to be thoughtful about veterans in active military and how they might be moving around. All right. I know this is a lot to absorb. Thank you for tuning in. If you have questions, like I said, feel free to reach out to us. I really encourage folks to be thoughtful about this and to start communicating internally within their institutions. For our part, there will be more to come in the way of probably maybe some sort of desk guide, and certainly future webinars once the proposed rule and final rules come out, et cetera. We want to try to keep making information available because we think this is very significant and we want folks to have time to be as thoughtful about it as possible. Otherwise, as always, I'm so thankful for all of you and what you do. Thank you for tuning in. And until next time, be well.